Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. Today we're doing a debate between Caleb Jackson and Stephen Ford, and they have links in the description where you can find some of their stuff and their work. And today we're going to be debating the empty tomb discussion. And the two sides of this debate are: is the empty tomb likely historical or is it likely ahistorical? And we have both of them on the bottom that are going to argue their points. We'll do 2 rounds each, 10 minutes opening statements, 5 minutes of rebuttals. Then they're going to do cross examination. And then we're going to go open it up to the chat and get your thoughts on all this stuff. So, and there's also a poll. If you want to look at if you want to wait on that poll, if you're not decided yet, don't vote yet. Wait till you hear their arguments. If you're fully decided and you don't care, you go ahead. You can vote now if you want. But it would be cool to see what everyone thinks after these arguments are made. So that being said, hit that intro. All right. We're here now, and there's a little bit of echo there. We're good, though. So we're starting off with Caleb, who's arguing for. Caleb is also a Christian. Stephen is agnostic. So we have, two sides on this coin right now going at this. But Caleb, you have 10 minutes. I'm getting the timer ready, and you're going to go first, and you're going to argue, is the tomb historical? And I just want to give you guys a second to introduce yourselves before we start. Go ahead, Stephen, first.
Hi, my name is Stephen Ford. I like you said, I'm agnostic. I'm on the skeptical side. Happy to be here.
Nice. Caleb, how's it going?
Yeah, Neil, it's good. Thanks for hosting this. I'm Caleb. I've been on Neil's channel before, and Derek Lambert's a Myth Vision. So, I'm just a Christian guy who likes to look at New Testament stuff and do this. But I'm just happy that we're doing a debate, and I don't think I've seen too many on this particular topic about the empty tomb and burial specifically. There's been plenty on the resurrection, which I think has been done to death, no pun intended. But it's nice to be able to focus on particular arguments and get more specific. But I did just want to say that we're doing this, trying to do it from a historical standpoint. We're not going to argue whether there's miracles or why the tomb would be empty or so forth. Just the question about that. So we're trying not to put the question of, the supernatural into it. So hopefully we can try to stay fairly objective with that. And I'm excited to see how this goes.
I'm looking forward to this as well. I'm going to drop myself down as well as Stephen, and I'm going to give you 10 minutes. I'll jump in when there's 5 minutes in, so you have half your time left, and then I'll come back with 2 minutes in, and then 1 minute, and then 30 seconds, and I'll give you 10 seconds. So you'll have some warnings and stuff. And let's start right now.
Gotcha. And can we see the slides or no?
Yep.
Okay, hold on. Let me
just restarted you.
Right,
so let me know when you want to start, and I'll start the time.
Okay. Yeah. Is it full screen or?
It's full screen. Yeah.
I'm looking at. Okay. Perfect. As long as you can see it.
Yeah. And I'm gonna
full screen and. Okay. Perfect.
Okay. And I'll drop Stephen down, and I'll drop myself down, and whoops. All right. Sorry about that. Hold on. You didn't start yet. It's okay.
Sort it out.
I dropped the wrong person down, so sorry. All right, now you're good.
All right, we're good to go. Okay, yeah. So as we said, we're debating whether the empty tomb of Jesus is historical. This is just a slide to show that how we're approaching the subject. So history is about probability, so we're not arguing with absolute certainty. So I'm not saying that the empty tomb is like virtually certain. I'm just saying that I think that when I say it is likely historical, I mean it is significantly more than 50% or 0.5. And so the formula up here is just saying we have the empty tomb hypothesis, E, and then not E, which is the not empty tomb hypothesis. And so that's really all we're arguing for. So I would say that we should weigh predictions of what the empty tomb theory would predict versus what the no empty tomb theory predict. And I would say that the no empty tomb theory would predict a lack of a proper burial or perhaps an unknown location of Jesus' body, perhaps some cognitive dissonance, and you would expect heavy apologetic elements to the story of the empty tomb in itself. So we're going to address those points as well. But first, let me spend some time on the burial of Jesus, because it's pretty relevant to the question of whether there was an empty tomb in the first place. So was the body of Jesus interred in a known location? I would argue that it's likely that it was. First of all, our earliest source about this would probably be the brief reference we have in 1 Corinthians 15:4, where Paul says, quoting a pre-Pauline creed, "For I delivered unto you as what was first importance to what I received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day." Now, Paul doesn't specify how Jesus was buried. It's vague as to what exactly he means, but it is at least consistent with the account we do find in the Gospels. It's also plausible, just prima facie, even if we didn't have any direct sources, that Jesus would have been buried, given that Jewish law required bodies, including bodies of executed criminals, to be buried before sunset. Deuteronomy 21 is the most obvious example of this, where it says, if a man's committed death, you shall not let him remain all night, but you shall bury him the first day, as I have cited there. So I would also say that it was common practice, for at least in the presence of Jewish criminals who were condemned by the Sanhedrin, as the Gospels tell us that Jesus was, for them to be buried by members of the Sanhedrin. We see this in the Mishnah, and our Gospels seem to agree with this, that there was a man named Joseph of Arimathea who took the body of Jesus after he was executed and buried him, giving him a quasi-honorable burial. We'll get to that moment in a second. And this is something that, again, we see in all four Gospels, and that we see in the creeds and Acts and some of the sermons, especially Acts 13, which many scholars do think is an early creed based on the non-Lucan vocabulary in that and some of the Semitism. So it's plausible that we do have many early traditions of that in that way. And I would say that it is unlikely that the gospel would invent such a burial for a couple of reasons. One of the main ones is that I think if the Gospels are trying to invent this ex nihilo from Scripture as a fulfillment of Scripture, this actually goes in contrast with what we would expect. If Jesus was dishonorably buried or not buried at all, this is actually consistent with what the Old Testament talks about with God's anointed one. You see in Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53, which Christians did use in reference to Jesus' death, you lay me in the dust of death. You can imagine Jesus' body being covered with sand and dirt would be consistent. That for dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. Imagine if dogs had eaten Jesus' body, as John Dominic Crossan suggests, correct? I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. Imagine the body of Jesus lying decomposed there in all this way, unburied. And they made his grave with the wicked and a rich man in his death, although he'd done no violence and no deceit. All these verses are ones that the Christians could have used if Jesus had been dishonorably buried or not buried, and could have said, oh, look, the fact that his body was treated with disrespect fulfills these passages in Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53, which we know that they were referencing. And so I think the fact that we see the opposite of this, that we see a contrast, we see an honorable burial when the scriptures speak of God's anointed having more of a dishonorable interment, as that's how they would have interpreted it, is quite surprising and inclines that they are not just, inventing this from scripture, but that this is an event that goes contrary to expectations. Another thing is that the burial, although it is honorable in many ways, Jesus is given spices, he's put in a rich man's tomb. In many ways, it's also holds elements of dishonor, which is also surprising if they're trying to cover up, a dishonorable burial, if they're trying to make this less embarrassing. We see that neither Jesus' family nor his friends are even present. The women do watch from a distance, according to Mark, but they never actually help in assisting the body being buried. It's all up to Joseph of Arimathea, and if John is correct, then Nicodemus as well. But we don't see Jesus' disciples or family present. And this is consistent with what we read in the Mishnah Sanhedrin about how for a Jewish person who was condemned by the court to die, there's no public mourning. We don't see public funerals as you would typically have, where you'd have, people go out playing music and wailing loudly.
5 minutes.
Thank you. In that way. And so it's surprising that we don't see this if this is an invented narrative in that way. And this is also just to show, when you look at almost any image of the burial of Jesus, you almost always see depictions of the women and the disciples accompanying the body, even though the Gospels never actually mention this. And so it seems like later traditions do want to make this more family involved and have the women involved, when we don't see this in the earliest Gospels. So again, this is a different trajectory than what we'd expect. I would also argue that it's very plausible that the tomb of Jesus was in fact venerated. This is a site that I know Neil has been to because he's been to Jerusalem. But I would argue that the Church of Holy Sepulchre has a pretty decent probability, I would say over 50%, of being the authentic tomb of Jesus. And there's a couple of reasons for this. I don't have time to get into it in detail, but the location outside the walls of the Jerusalem, at least the original walls, the ones there are later ones, points to it being consistent with what the Gospels say with crucifixions. And we know that this was expanded in the 40s, other presences of tombs there and so forth. In fact, most Jerusalem archaeologists who've commented on it do in fact hold that it's very likely. And I have a quote here from Dan Bayhat about this, that we really don't have any evidence that it's not, and it's very plausibly matching up with the archaeology. We have a good chance that this is in fact the burial spot that was preserved since probably the 40s AD for Jesus' site. So that I've argued for the burial of Jesus being plausibly historically true, we get into the empty tomb. Now, the reason why the burial is relevant is because whether the question of a known location of a tomb would come into play. Now, Acts does say that the disciples waited 40 days before they shared the resurrection. And so people could say that the body was perhaps decomposed by the time, that no one would be able to identify it. And there were Jewish laws that just said that you can't just take a body out and march it around, and parade it or in that way. So there's reason to think that you wouldn't just have the Pharisees parading the body out like some apologists would say. But we need not forget that Jews practiced secondary burial called ossuagium, which is where they would take the body after decomposed after a year and put the bones in an ossuary, in a box like you've pictured here. And this also applied to condemned criminals as well, so, at least from the Jewish courts. So that's why I have the quotes there from the Mishnah. And so if Jesus' body was put in a known location, at some point it would have been expected that once he decomposed, the bones would have to be collected and put in a box. And so this entails that people would have to come visit the tomb at some point, take the bones, identify them as Jesus's, and so forth. So if the body wasn't going missing, then we'd have to expect at some point it would be put in an ossuary, and that would just raise far more questions. And so the fact that it seems hard to imagine how this could happen if the body was still there, I think points to the tomb being empty. As Raymond Brown says, the common burial place provided by the court, he's talking about the Sanhedrin, is not thought of as an indistinguishable common grave, but one where the corpses were recoverable. And that's how I would also say the empty tomb has a very primitive tradition. There's many non-Markan features we see in the Aramaic vocabulary, including how it contradicts how Mark usually says on the first day of the week when he's predicting the resurrection, but it says after 3 days, which would put it on a Monday. There's non-Markan elements.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Thank you. There's also a lack of extensive theological titles. We don't see Jesus in Mark 16 called Lord. We don't see very many appeals to Scripture. We don't see Christological titles. If you look at the later Gospels, you do see those. But the fact that Mark's tradition is very primitive is significant, especially compared to Mark 15, where you see plenty of Old Testament allusions, plenty of theological titles. Jesus called the Son of God, but you don't see any of this in the empty tomb tradition. And so I think this points to a very primitive tradition that probably predates Mark by a significant point. Of course, a very well-known argument, and one I know that Stephen has heard before, is that the fact that women are reported as the first ones to visit the tomb seems less likely under an invented theory. Now, women were generally speaking not typically permitted to speak in court because they were considered credulous and untrustworthy. There were some exceptions to this, so it wasn't a complete rule, but generally it was a riskier move to include this. And we do see the later Gospels putting more emphasis on the male witnesses. Luke and John, Peter and John visit the tomb, and Luke in the Gospel of Luke and John. 1 minute, got it. And so I think the fact that we see this, and we see critics like Celsus using this and picking on how Mary Magdalene was a frantic woman and how Christians were only able to convince the stupid, the women and the children, is evidence against this being a tradition that was probably invented for purely apologetic reasons. And so to conclude, I would say the burial of Jesus is likely historical and was in a known location. And when you combine this with the tradition of ossuagium, it makes it likely that people would have had to visit the tomb at some point to take the bones. The Markan empty tomb account is probably primitive and shows few signs of theological development. The female witnesses to the empty tomb are unlikely to be fictional, and therefore it's probably better predicted on the historical hypothesis. And I'll just end with this quote with Dale Allison that says, "The empty tomb, as I read the evidence, is slightly stronger possibility. Indications are not lacking which permit it to that the discovery of the empty tomb is likely historical, but of course he does this with some hesitation. So not super likely in his eyes, but more likely than not." So I'll end on that note.
Perfect timing. Good job. I really enjoyed that. That was well said. Oh, dismissed that. Okay. I'll bring Stephen back up. I will bring this down. And Stephen, you have 10 minutes let me just get the timer ready before I start, and then I'm going to bring him down. I'm going to give you the full screen. And just give me 1 second to get the timer ready. Okay, I'm ready when you are. Oh, you're muted. Sorry, buddy.
All right.
Let me know when you want me to start the time.
Yep, right now. That's
okay.
Good. Okay. Okay, so in this debate, I'm going to be arguing that the way that Jesus is buried in the Gospels is the least likely possibility out of all the possible things that could have happened to his body. Him being buried in the most expensive imaginable way is the least likely option. If we consider all of the different possible things that could have happened to his body after he was dead, he could have been left on the cross for vultures and wild dogs. That's option one. We know that that the Romans did this a lot. Martin Hengel states in Crucifixion in the Ancient World, page 87 and 88, he says crucifixion was aggravated further by the fact that quite often its victims were never buried. It was a stereotyped picture that the crucified victims served as food for wild beasts and birds of prey. In this way, his humiliation was made complete. What it meant for a man in antiquity to be refused burial and the dishonor which went with it can hardly be appreciated by modern man. This is option one. We know that this happened. We have plenty of ancient texts talking about this, that this was done to crucified individuals. But it's also possible that the Jews would have pitched enough of a fit about Deuteronomy 21 being violated that maybe the Romans allowed bodies to be taken down and buried. If that was the case, option two, thrown into a mass grave with other dead bodies. So, one, Jesus' body was left on the cross for vultures and dogs. Two, he was thrown into a mass grave with the other guys who were crucified right next to him. Three, he could have just been buried. He could have had his own individual grave in the ground, and maybe it was marked, maybe it wasn't, but it wasn't in a wealthy tomb. So the burial in the sepulcher of Joseph of Arimathea, option four, is the least likely of those options. And the reason it's the least likely is because of what Jesus was convicted of, which was sedition against the Roman Empire, the worst crime you could be convicted of. I find it very hard to believe that the Romans would allow a convicted seditionist to be given the most honorable and most expensive burial imaginable. Right under having your own mausoleum built. So that's my first argument. My second argument is, and actually Caleb addressed this in his presentation, but my second argument is that Christians would have remembered the location of the sepulcher over the years, and that they did not. Now, Caleb made an interesting argument. I didn't expect him to say that he thinks that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the actual burial location of Jesus. I think he said it was over 50% in his estimation. I have a quote here from James D. Tabor, an archaeologist, in his book, The Jesus Dynasty, page 225 through 226. He says, the authenticity of either site is problematic, the Protestant site and the Catholic site. The tomb at the Protestant site has been dated to the Iron Age, 5th century BC, which is much too early to fit the description of a newly hewn tomb. The Catholic site, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, is based upon traditions from the 4th century, a full 300 years after Jesus' crucifixion. It is just yards from the ancient northern city wall, near a deep rock quarry, an unlikely area for new tombs and gardens. Its authenticity was based on relics that Empress Helena claimed to find, such as the true cross of Jesus buried nearby, bolstered by visions and reported miracles. The tomb that Helena chose is very likely that of John Hyrcanus, the 2nd century BC Maccabean ruler. It was mentioned a number of times by Josephus precisely in that location. This site simply does not fit the biblical or historical record. So this is from James D. Tabor in the Jesus Dynasty. And I think that that kind of settles it in my mind as being under 50% likely the tomb of Jesus. There's no ancient sources that talk about Christians visiting the site or venerating it before the 4th century. So yeah, I really don't think that Caleb's assessment of the evidence is very very accurate. Okay, my third argument.
5 minutes left.
Mm-hmm. My third argument is that, In Caleb's presentation, he showed pictures in Christian art, of Jesus being taken off the cross. One thing that you also find a lot in Christian art is depictions of Jesus' crucifixion being surrounded by crowds of people all watching him. This is extremely inaccurate, and the reason it's inaccurate is because crucifixion was not an event that one would go to watch, like a beheading or burning or something like that. Crucifixions took a long time. You didn't just die, you languished on the cross for hours and usually days. So I find it extremely unlikely that the disciples of Jesus or the family of Jesus were just hanging out for 6 hours waiting for him to die, and they didn't even know that he would die after 6 hours. You know, they would have expected him to last for days. So are they gonna stay there for days waiting for him to die? I find that to be extremely unlikely. So and there's also a text from the Mishnah that states that if you have a relative or loved one who's crucified, you should get out of the city. You shouldn't stay there because of the shame of the situation. It's Semachat 2:13. It says, if one's husband, wife, father, or mother has been crucified in his city, one should not continue to reside there unless it is a city as big as Antioch. Even then, one should not reside in the same side of the city, but in another part. Until when is one so forbidden? Until the flesh is completely decomposed and the identity unrecognizable from the bones. So I find it very unlikely that Jesus' disciples or his family were there when he did eventually die. They wouldn't have just waited around for hours and days. And so if they weren't around, who was around? Well, the Romans who were guarding him, obviously. And what would the Romans have done with his body after he did die? They would have thrown it into a criminal's grave. They would not have buried it in an expensive tomb. All right, so and this is I have a fourth point. This isn't really an argument, but it's just something to take note of. A nice burial in a wealthy tomb is exactly the kind of thing that Christians would have made up for their religious figure that they worship as a god. Of course, they don't want him to have a dishonorable burial, being eaten by vultures or dogs, or thrown into a common grave. They would want to imagine that, oh, he was given this expensive and extremely honorable burial.
2
by
minutes.
this Jewish, gotcha, by this Jewish Sanhedrin member. So in my remaining time, I'm just going to go through some of the stuff that Caleb mentioned. So, okay, in 1 Corinthians 15, he mentions, Paul says in the early creed that, Jesus was buried after he died. Of course, this doesn't imply burial in a tomb. It could also just be burial on the ground. And the point Paul was making when he said that Jesus was buried, the point was to make it clear that he was really dead. He didn't survive the crucifixion. So it wasn't about his burial. It was about his death. That was the whole point. Okay, so let's see here. The empty tomb tradition being primitive, predating Mark, doesn't mean that it was real. It could be an earlier tradition that was still made up. Women discovering the tomb, I really didn't expect Caleb to make this argument, because I find this to be probably the weakest argument for the empty tomb. There are so many reasons why a gospel writer would have
1 minute.
imagined women discovering the tomb. It goes with the first shall be last and the last shall be first motif. Women were the ones who prepared the body with spices. It was considered a women's job. So there's so many reasons why the gospel writers would have had women discover the tomb. It doesn't mean that it was true. All right. And that's the end of my argument.
Okay, so you're just going to end it there. That's 10
Yep.
seconds anyway. Yeah, let's get Caleb back up here for a second. And so, Caleb, you muted right now. You're muted. Just make sure you unmute yourself. 5 minutes in this next one.
Okay.
5 rebuttals to what was just said, or you can add stuff, whatever you want to do. You got 5 more minutes. You probably want to rebuttal whatever was said. Probably better for your case. But you have 5 minutes, so you do whatever you want with it. And Caleb, you will. Do you need any charts or anything that you want to upload, or just your full screen?
No, I have notes, but it's not going to be visual, and that's fine. And luckily, at 5 minutes, I know it's a short time, but we have the cross examination as well because there's a lot of stuff here. So
and the cross examination is as long as you guys need until you're both done asking questions, and then questions. If you super chat, you go first, but you don't have to super chat. I'm not making you super chat. If you want to ask a question after the super chats are done, if I see questions, I'm going to ask them. So you don't have to pay.
And are we doing a 2-minute warning, like a 30-second warning? How is this working for the rebuttals?
So for 5 minutes, I'll do 2 minutes. I'll do 1 minute, 30 seconds, 10 seconds. So I'm just cutting that whole first half off. That's it.
Got it.
So you have 5 minutes, and let me just give you full screen, and let me know when you are ready to start the timer.
I'm ready to start the timer.
Go ahead.
All right. Yeah. So first of all, thank you so much, Stephen, for that rebuttal. I thought there were a lot of really good points there, and a couple that made me smile because I was happy that some of them were brought up. So I think the first contention that Stephen had is that he thinks that the burial of Jesus by Joseph Arimathea is the least likely. And he says that there are other options are that he was left on the cross, that he was thrown into a mass grave, that he was buried in an individual grave, or that he was put in Joseph's tomb. I will agree that the third option, that he was buried in an individual grave in terms of like in a coffin in a dirt grave with perhaps a marker, is not unlikely. I think that's somewhat plausible, but I do think that the first two options are pretty unlikely, given that Jewish law did preclude bodies from being left up all night in that way. And a mass grave is not consistent with Paul's language as he would use earlier. A mass grave is the denial of burial. It's literally just throwing bodies on a garbage pile to be exposed to animals to being eaten and so forth. And so this was not even count as a proper burial in Judaism, as people like Jacob Connell have argued and so forth. So another point is that Stephen says that Jesus would probably not have been given a proper burial, been allowed by the Romans because he was a seditionist. And while he is correct that those committed by treason would probably be denied a proper burial, sedition and treason were categorically different in Roman law. For example, Oppian, in his Duties of the Proconsul, Book 9, says that the bodies of those who are condemned to death should not be refused to their relatives. At present, the bodies of those who have been punished are only buried when this has been requested and permission granted. And sometimes it is not permitted, especially where persons have been convicted of high treason, even when bodies of those who have been sentenced to be burned can claimed in order the bones to be collected. So treason, it is true, was denied, but sedition is different. And we do see this as a seditionist, as this as a label for Jesus, with similar language that people like Josephus mention. For example, he refers to Josephus in, if I can find it here, refers to, here it goes. He says in Antiquity 17:10-8 that several companies of seditious like created a king immediately in order to do mischief to the public. So this idea of being called a king, which Jesus was called King of the Jews, would be considered sedition, but sedition is not technically considered something that would be worthy of unburial. It's different than treason. And this is argued by John Granger Cook in his article called Crucifixion and Burial, published in New Testament Studies 2011, if you want to check that out. In terms of the location being remembered, I'm really glad actually that Stephen mentioned this. I think this is an interesting argument, and it doesn't get brought up enough in these discussions. I was surprised that he quoted James Tabor, who thinks that the Talpiot tomb of Jesus is authentic, which is a fairly fringe view in scholarship. And they've had conferences where 48 out of 50 archaeologists thought that the Talpiot tomb was almost certainly not correct. I'm not saying the consensus proves that it's not, but I do think that's incorrect. In terms of Tabor's claim that the tradition comes from the 4th century, that is technically true if you're talking about the actual written textual claims that we have. Helena had gone to Jerusalem, she had had visions, and she had spoken with the bishops there, and the bishops told her that the temple of Hadrian that sat there, which was built in the early 2nd century, was built over a tomb of Jesus, and they passed this tradition down from the temple's construction. Thank you. Hadrian had built this temple in order to stop the Christians from venerating it. And when they tore the temple down, lo and behold, they did find a tomb there in this case. And as I did when I quoted Dan Bayhat in my opening, he said that although the textual traditions do that, the actual location outside the walls of Jerusalem do in fact point to a date closer to about the 40s AD, because those walls were expanded by Herod about 41 AD, meaning that if this was a later tradition that happened after the fall of Jerusalem, when the walls were expanded and there was a bunch of destruction, it would be almost impossible to get all of this right in terms of knowing that there are 1st century tombs there, knowing the location outside the walls, etc. So I think there is very good archaeological ground for this, and I don't think Tabor's arguments are substantiated. In terms of being on the cross for days, I would point out this was on Passover and on Sabbath. And so this is why they broke the legs of the criminals to bury them, because they would not want the bodies, even if they were alive, hanging there during Sabbath. That would be a direct violation of Deuteronomy.
1 minute.
And so it's true that crucifixion victims usually did leave up there. We have to understand when you combine it with Jewish sentiments, that's unlikely. He quotes Simchat 2:11, which says that bodies can be left up, and sometimes that is true. Although I would say that the verse he was quoting was talking about cities in general, which is why it mentions Antioch, and I don't know if that applies to Jerusalem specifically, since Jerusalem did have different standards for that. And there's other places, for example, Simchat 2:9 does say that the Roman governments that Jews still bury bodies, even if the Roman government executes them, they are still allowed to request bodies. And so I think if we quote the Simchat in other places, it does line up with the consistent burial. I also disagree that Christians would, in fact, make up a burial. As I already said, I think there are embarrassing elements to it, and I think it fulfills Scripture. And Christians did not shy away from the shame of the crucifixion. They wanted they wanted to depict Jesus' suffering for their sins, and doing this in accordance with Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22. And so a dishonorable burial would only add on to Jesus' suffering and his redemption for our sins. With that, I will hold off on the cross-examination to address the points that he raised for my arguments, and I will conclude it there.
Awesome. That's a great round there. And Stephen, I'm going to break the timer set once again. And let's see. Let me know when you're ready.
I'm ready.
All right, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, his first argument was Jewish law precluded bodies from being left. It was to say that the first option that I gave, because I gave 3 options of what could have happened to Jesus' body. His argument was that the first option is extremely unlikely because Jewish law, of course, Deuteronomy 21, precluded bodies being left up, after sunset. And I mean, I don't find it that likely that Romans would have disregarded Jewish law, since they did that all the time. I recall how Pontius Pilate raided the temple treasury in order to fund an aqueduct. Recall how Pilate, deliberately insulted the Jewish, religious sensitivities by bringing, images of the emperor inside the holy city. I mean, the Jewish law got broken by the Romans all the time. Claudius, I believe, was even gonna put a statue of himself in the temple. I mean, there's so many examples of Romans not caring about Jewish law. So I don't think that adequately refutes the first possibility. He also said that throwing somebody in a mass grave wouldn't count as burial. So I guess that was in regards to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, saying that Jesus was buried. If he was buried in a mass grave, Paul wouldn't have said he was buried. Like I said, not only was nobody there when Jesus' body was taken off the cross, so nobody actually knew whether he was thrown into a mass grave or buried some other way. So there would be no reason to not say that Jesus was buried. Not only that, like I said, Paul's point in saying that Jesus was buried was to express the certainty about Jesus being dead. He was dead and buried. Okay, he really died. He didn't survive the crucifixion. That was the whole point. Okay. He also says that James Tabor isn't reliable because of his opinion on the Talpiot tomb, and that's really an example of the genetic fallacy. Just because James Tabor has a controversial opinion about one issue that's completely unrelated to this conversation, that means that you can't trust his opinion on something that's completely unrelated. That's completely the genetic fallacy. And if you have a problem with James Tabor, I can read you a quote from Maurice Casey. This is from Jesus of Nazareth, page 452. This site is, however, supported only by a late pilgrim tradition, which does not emerge until the 4th century, and the conjecture that the tradition was handed down from the first witnesses is extremely improbable, since no early source mentions it. So
2 minutes.
All right. So James Tabor and Maurice Casey, and I'm sure I could find more quotes from other people who don't think that, we can discuss that later. Okay, the thing about the legs of the criminals being broken to follow Deuteronomy 21, that doesn't really follow, because Deuteronomy 21 doesn't say you can't leave an alive person hanging after sundown. It's only dead bodies that have to be taken down. So if the crucified criminals are languishing overnight, that doesn't violate the law at all, because they're still alive. It's only when they die that they have to be taken down. And he also said that the burial of Jesus has embarrassing elements, and I'm struggling to understand how the most honorable and most expensive burial imaginable, apart from getting your own mausoleum, is embarrassing at all. I cannot fathom how, like, what is even remotely embarrassing about that? Is it
1 minute.
that Jesus had a secret follower in the Sanhedrin? Because I don't think that's embarrassing at all. I mean, that just shows how influential Jesus was. It makes him look better if even a member of the Sanhedrin becomes his disciple. I mean, yeah. So you also mentioned treason and sedition being different, and I really we should probably discuss that later, because I think that calling yourself king when you're not appointed by the emperor, that's
30 seconds.
the worst crime in the eyes of Rome. I don't see how the Romans would have given you a break. We can discuss that. All right, I'm done.
All right, let me stop the timer then. Perfect timer for perfect timing. This is going to be a cross examination now. I'm going to drop on the bottom. I'm going to make it like a split screen duo, and this is no timer. You guys can take as much time as you need until you're both done asking each other questions. I see the super chats for everybody. I appreciate them. You guys are ahead of everybody in the questions segment. So super chats get read first, and then we go to questions. So, if you can't afford a super chat, don't worry, I'll get your question in there. But if you super chat, you are supporting me, and I appreciate it. Also, you get the first crack at the questions. All right. So with that being said, let me drop down and go ahead.
So we just like asking each other, I guess, just whoever wants to go first, or
you can go first, since you went first with the introductions.
Yeah, so I think like these, it might just be good to talk about each of these points, since I know that it's hard to cover these in a rebuttal, right? When you have 5 minutes and it goes by a lot faster than you think.
Yeah.
So what I think on one point about this goes with the first point you made about being left on the cross, or the mass grave thing, when we said the mass grave isn't technically burial. I think the Greek that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 15 is not like, I think that you're trying to imply that he's saying like he was dead and buried, as if it's like an idiom, like doesn't literally mean that, but just a phrase to say like he was definitely dead as a doornail or something.
No, I'm not saying it was an idiom.
Okay, maybe I misunderstood what you were trying to say then. But you don't think Paul's like referring to a literal burial, but that he's just definitely dead. He's like
Paul mentioning the burial was the point of that was to emphasize the certainty of Jesus' death. So that nobody could say, oh, maybe he survived the crucifixion. He was buried, meaning he was really, really dead. That was the whole point of it. So it doesn't matter how Jesus was buried. The whole point of Paul saying he was buried was just to express the certainty that Jesus was really dead. And Paul probably didn't even know how Jesus was buried or what happened to his body, because nobody was there, like I said. And I think that really the only way for you to get past this point is to explain like why anybody would wait around for 6 hours waiting for somebody on the cross to die. I find that to be extremely unlikely.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Greek Paul uses there is the triple hotikos. So he says, and that he died, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day. So there's like separate thoughts there. So I don't think the burial is connected to the death itself, but I don't want to get into the semantics of the Greek in that way. But in terms of the waiting around part, and you are right that people like would pass by, and this was like something you'd be walking.
It was on the road.
Yep. Yeah, right. It was on the road.
They would pass by crucified criminals like modern day people pass by roadkill.
Right. Yeah, sure. And I don't think that
often watch it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's true. But I mean, it was Passover, so it was very crowded, or at least like, well, it depends on if it's Mark or John in terms of it's on Passover or near it. But the point is, there have been a lot of people there at the time, right? But I do think
not on the road.
Sure, in the city on the road, but it would have been outside of the city, because you couldn't do that inside the city limits. But you do see in Philo and in the Semachad as well, where it mentions giving it to the family specifically. So typically it would be relayed over them. So I do think the families would have an interest in waiting there for the person to die in that sense. Now, of course, the family of Jesus, well, I mean, Mary, the mother wasn't there, but some of the companions of him, or even though the disciples had ran off at that point, were there. And they're the ones who, according to Mark at least, saw the body being taken down and entombed in a tomb in that sense. So I guess I just don't see any implausibility in terms of the breaking the legs and the Passover. I think the concern was that if they were to die like overnight or during that, they would have to be burying them. So killing them in advance, or at least having that there, would be a particular way to do it. And so like having people who are, they didn't have a direct way to die.
That goes completely against the whole purpose of crucifixion. The whole purpose was to prolong the agony for as long as possible. What's the point in crucifying somebody if you're just going to break their legs in 6 hours?
Well, I think so. I mean, I also don't know I don't know how long the other people have been up there for, in terms of whether he was crucified between two criminals according to Mark, but whether they had already been up there for days, or whether Jesus, and Jesus was being added to it, or whether they all were up at the same time. I don't think it's clear. But I do think that having that at the Passover to cut off that point, like if they had been crucified on a Tuesday or something, maybe they would have been left up there. But Jesus, of course, was flogged very severely and stuff before that. So the fact that he probably would have died even before, all the blood loss and stuff like that, even prior to that, is I guess I just don't think that is particularly implausible. Plus, people like Dale Allison have said, like, if that was the case, why not give Jesus more words to say? Why not stretch out the death? Why not give more conversations about that, make it more dramatic? So I think there's just a lot of speculation there, but I guess I just don't see that as overly persuasive in that way. But
regarding Jesus flogging, I don't think we know how badly Jesus was flogged, because it's often argued that Jesus was given the cat of nine tails 39 times, and that seems to me a complete contradiction. The cat of nine tails was a Roman instrument. The 39 lashes is from Jewish law. The Romans would not abide by the Jewish law. They would have flogged Jesus however much they felt they needed to, so that he would have survived on the cross for as long as he's supposed to survive. So I don't think they would have flogged him within an inch of his life so that he would die in 6 hours. That seems very unlikely to me.
Yeah, well, I agree with you. I don't know if it was a Roman cat of nine. I'm sorry, it was a Jewish cat of nine tails. It would have been a Roman flogging, so that's fair. But again, I think this is just. I feel like, given the sentiments of that kind of burial, that having people up there at all would have offended the Jews in terms of, even if they're suffering, right? Because if they happen to die on Passover, or like during, like overnight, or during that process or something, that would have been a problem. So I guess just having it more efficient seems to me to make sense.
Didn't Romans offend the Jews all the time, like with Pilate and Claudius?
You brought that up, actually, because that's the second point I wanted to get to. So thank you for bringing that up. So yeah, I think that generally speaking, when we read like Philo and Josephus, and we know that Caesar had an edict, Caesar Augustus did, that said that the Romans are to abide by the Jewish law. And Philo says that this was the norm, the tradition had been set. Now, you do bring up, there's a couple instances with Pilate specifically about, one of them was with an aqueduct, and two of them were with shields or statues, and whether that's the same instance or not is
probably separate incidents.
Probably separate incidents. I agree with that, but it doesn't really matter for the sake of the conversation. For the first one, for the second one, we'll start with that one first. For the shields and the in that situation, or the statues, in both of those cases, in one of them, Pilate does threaten them, uses force, and then when the Jews basically, put their neck up and say, go ahead, he ends up relenting and steps back down and doesn't do it. The second time with the shields, he does originally offend them, and then they go and tell Tiberius, and then Tiberius says, Pilate, what are you doing? Take it down, and gets basically yelled at and scolded at by Tiberius. And so in those cases, you do see originally Pilate showing resistance and the Jews pressuring him and threatening of, we're going to tell Caesar, and then Pilate backs down, which is ironically what you see in John, where they said, friend of Caesar's, Pilate, and eventually they're able to twist his arm to get him to give in, like we do see with some of those situations. Even Caligula, who tried to, I think you had said, you maybe said one of the other ones, but it was Caligula who wanted to build a statue in the 40s. And he goes out, and when Herod's like, that's a bad idea. When he goes out to his balcony, there's like a crowd of thousands of Jews that are angrily protesting. He says, maybe I shouldn't do this. And so he ends up not building the statue because of protests. So I do think that we have plenty of instances of them backing down or having second thoughts about that, because they didn't want to start another rebellion. Of course, Passover was a very notorious time for rebellions. Plenty of them happened because they were very zealous, because they're remembering, Passover is when we celebrate being relieved from the Egyptians and the Exodus. And, look, Rome is still taking over us and telling us what to do. So a lot of zealots were there really excited about fighting back. So given that it was Passover, especially, I think Pilate would have been extra careful in terms of not wanting to start a riot. That's why Josephus says they were literally guarding the temple for that reason.
Yeah, so if Passover is like that, the Romans would probably want to discourage rebellions more by making the crucifixion as severe as it's supposed to be, right? Not taking somebody down after 6 hours and giving them a decent burial.
Well, but if that were to cause another riot of people being mad because they were offending it, right? Because they weren't abiding Jewish law, then I think that would just make it worse.
So let's say they were left up after sundown. So you imagine the next morning, a crowd of Jews is going to show up to Pilate's headquarters and threaten to tell Tiberius, or stick their necks out like they did.
Probably not the next morning, given that it would have been Sabbath, but like the Sunday after that, like the 2 days after, whenever they would have been allowed to come out and do that. Yeah, I think so, and I think you do see that with the examples we gave. You see that with and when the Jewish revolt happened with Florus, when they were upset about that, they ended up having rebellions there. They did it with Jesus ben Ananias. They did it with when Josephus tells us that there were Samaritans improperly sacrificing birds in the temple, and the Jews got mad and went to the governor and were complaining about it, that our laws are being violated, do something about it. You saw this actually, it's fairly common, and most people who write on this would agree with that. And Josephus does tell us, and I believe it's in Jewish War, that it was common practice that prior to the war, that it was common practice to bury even malefactors who've been crucified, and that was like the norm. Now, during the war and afterwards, they did have different rules because it was wartime and it got more complicated. But prior to that, which was Jesus's time, it was actually the norm according to Josephus, where he tells us this. And of course, that we do have crucified remains of Yohanan and stuff like that. Granted,
yeah, one out of thousands.
One out of thousands, right? But as Jody Magnus and Dale Allison will point out, we also almost never have the hands and the feet of skeletons in Jerusalem. And the only reason we even have the one of Yohanan is because the nail was bent, and they, usually they take it out. And so it's almost impossible to tell if someone has actually been crucified just by the skeleton. And so it's not surprising that we do only have one, given that it was an accident that the nail got stuck. So I don't think that's much of an argument there. But
so you don't think the nails ever got bent?
Well, I think it's fairly rare. I mean, we have one in England that was found, I think, last year as well. So I mean, it did happen sometimes, but it's not super common. But we do have textual evidence again from Josephus and Philo and the Semachath, which does say that sometimes it was denied, but other places it says that it could be requested and approved. So I'm not saying it was always accepted in there because, again, treason, but I think in many cases in Jerusalem, especially, it was, and there's pretty good textual and archaeological evidence to say that. So I just don't think it's implausible that the body would have been taken down in that way. Now, whether it was in a ground shallow grave in a coffin or with Joseph Arimathea's tomb, I think is a better debate and a better conversation, and like more uncertain in terms of arguments for there. But yeah, that's all I had on that.
If the Romans were worried about the Sabbath, and they would have had to break the legs of the criminals and everything, why not just crucify somebody on another day? Why not just hold them in a prison and then crucify them when it was a better day, when they wouldn't have to break their legs?
Yeah, well, I mean, I believe they did keep the Sanhedrin did keep Jesus overnight when they had the trial and all that stuff. But it looks like it was very rough. And of course, they broke a lot of laws doing that, because the way Mark describes it, it wouldn't be consistent with how it is in the Mishnah. So they were illegally doing a lot of trials and stuff like that. But it looks like they're twisting Pilate's arm in the Gospels in terms of getting him to do this on a particular time and stuff like that. So.
Well, I wouldn't agree that the trial of Jesus is an accurate historical account. I think that's one of the least accurate accounts in the Gospels, but that's a different topic.
Right.
I would like to read real quick a quote from Maurice Casey, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Regarding the okay, so he talks about the name Golgotha being, of course, the skull, the skull place. He says in Jesus of Nazareth, page 446, the truth about the Golgotha place is probably quite gruesome. All right. When the flesh rotted or was torn from the bones themselves would fall to the ground. Dogs love arm bones and leg bones and are not averse to picking rib cages, but they are not generally known to run off with skulls. So the Tribune, his cohort, the three victims, and Simon of Cyrene probably arrived at a place strewn with skulls, and hence known as the skull place. So this, I think, is based on the name, I think that is more evidence that that this was done, that bodies were left on the cross and not taken down right away, and that dogs were allowed to run off with bones, except for the skulls, because they didn't want the skulls. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I have not heard that before, though. I had always read Golgotha as referring to it as in whether it was shaped like a skull, as some people think, or whether that's just
yeah,
like
I know that's the common
right,
that's
the
the
place of
common
death. I
idea.
think that's reading a lot into it. Like,
Mm.
I think that's like quite a lot to infer from that, and I think that just given that the multiple textual evidences we have from that, plus the fact that we don't have any archaeological evidence of a mass grave, as far as I'm aware. I don't think we've ever discovered one in Jerusalem. So I think in terms of like a Roman mass grave. So I just think the evidence for that's very slim in that way.
Considering how often Romans crucified people, do you really think that it's likely that the Jews would have rioted every single time they broke Deuteronomy 21? Because I don't find that to be likely. I think that what the Romans did, the Jews accepted. This is what they do. We just have to live with it. The thing about them letting the Jews keep their laws, they allowed the Jews to practice their own religious laws and stuff. That didn't mean that the Jewish laws could enforce what the Romans were allowed to do. The Romans still had their practices, especially when it came to punishment, and Jewish sensitivities weren't going to get in the way of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Romans had their own procedures unless it contradicted the Jewish ones, right? But in terms of like, was there right every time? I think there could have been a couple that may have sparked it. But Josephus does tell us there were tens of thousands of riots. Now, granted, that is probably hyperbole. Josephus is usually not accurate numbers, but certainly I think that would have been common. If we just read Josephus, there's like a dozen messianic movements and doing it at various points. So I just think that it's likely that Pilate would have probably known about this, and this would have been fairly. I actually think it would have been fairly regular procedure in this way because of the sensitivities there. And again, we do have Josephus who literally tells us that in terms of it was common. That was the norm. Now there were exceptions, perhaps for treason and so forth, but from every textual source we have in Jerusalem, right, including the now the Simchat 2:11 does speak of that, but it's referencing it just cities in because it says Antioch, so we don't know if it's talking about Jerusalem specifically. It may be, but then early in the Simchat, it does talk about how it can be requested and it can be either approved or denied. And you do have Josephus and you have Philo, who's granted talking about Alexandria, not Jerusalem. And you have the Simchat and of course the Gospels and Paul. So I just think that with the collectivity of it, I just don't see it as implausible given the sources we have for that and in that way. But if we want to move on to do we want to talk about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre or that or the invention of the burial of Jesus in the first place, like the embarrassing elements or lack of either of those?
Yeah, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, I don't know if we're going to get very far on that because it seems like it's just going to be your scholars against my scholars,
Mm-hmm. Well, I will say that most Tabor may be an exception because he's kind of a quasi scholar and archaeologist, but a good number of archaeologists, I do think that they have an advantage in terms of that, like Kristen Romy, Dan Bayhat, Catherine Gaylor, Amos Kloner, Shimon Gibson, Jody Magnus, among others, do think that it's plausibly. Now we can't know for sure in that way. And I think the only real argument against it on that is just that we just don't happen to have any references to the 4th century, which sounds to me like kind of a weak argument from silence. So we just don't happen to have any references to it. And that to me isn't like overly persuasive. I mean, it's a little bit of evidence against it, but I think, is it more likely that there would have been a spot that just wasn't mentioned, or is it more likely that you'd have the archaeology lining up in the way that it did 300 years later if people were just picking a spot at random, or if this wasn't based off of something, for you to get these archaeological verisimilitudes correct? And so I think that is a significant point. And as I said, it wasn't just Helena we did find a spot in that way, but she talked with the bishops who told her that it was under a site that Hadrian had built back in the 2nd century. So now we're back to the 2nd century. And they said Hadrian had built a spot over Jesus' tomb because Christians were venerating it. So according to them, the site was being venerated up till about the 2nd century. And so when they tore that down, they did find a tomb there, and that's where they built the church on top of it, and so forth. And if you actually look at the walls of Jerusalem, the way it's located, originally it was inside the walls, which seems like a contradiction with how crucifixions would have been. But we've discovered in the 60s and 70s there was an older set of walls that it was outside of at the time, and those walls were expanded by Herod in the 40s AD. So you can trace the archaeology back pretty close to like about a decade after the crucifixion in terms of when the walls were expanded and when the site would have been known about and so forth. So I do think that is pretty.
But nothing in Acts or in Paul's letters about Christians venerating that tomb, or that would have been, I would think, the most popular location in all of Israel for Christians to go to. You know, the site that Jesus rose from the dead. I mean, I would think that Christians would be flocking there, right?
Well, I mean, apparently, if Hadrian builds a temple over it because they were flocking there, then they might have been. I mean, I would say they probably were. And if it's just we don't have any direct textual evidence of it, that's not overly surprising to me. Archaeology, I think, is more surefire than the testimony of a person, generally speaking. And so, we don't have any. If there were like texts that said, and this spot has been forgotten and no one knows what it is.
Archaeology doesn't say that this was Jesus' tomb. It just says when the walls were expanded and when
that's true, but it says it's consistent with it's consistent with the details described in the gospel. So either that's a coincidence, or I mean, it could, unless it's just a very impressive one that they happen to get the spot right where the walls would be, where the rock cut tombs would be from the 1st century. There's also soil there that indicates a garden. It's also on top of where a mountain would have been. And all that stuff. So it's consistent with that. If people are getting this right 300 years later after the fall of Jerusalem, that's to me it just seems more likely under the hypothesis that the traditions are right and that this was preserved up till that time. I just don't see a good argument against it other than the fact that it just wasn't mentioned explicitly in a text up until then. But that seems to me like a fairly weak argument.
All right. So we can move on to, I would love to know why you think that the most honorable and expensive burial, short of having your own mausoleum built, is an embarrassing detail.
Yeah, so I would say that it was quasi-embarrassing. So you are right that Jesus is given spices, a nice burial. I'm not going to include all the details on John and Luke, because I bet we're mostly talking about Mark here. In that way, that he's washed and wrapped. And there are some people who think that those are embellishments later on in the later Gospels where it's getting more honorable, and that might be the case, but that's not really relevant to my point. But people like Byron McCain, who I cited, and others, and Raymond Brown, have said that if you actually look at the details of it, it actually has a lot of dishonorable elements because typically in Judaism, an honorable burial consisted of two main things. One is that you were put in your family's tomb, where you were prepared by the family and relatives, and the second one is that you had a public mourning and you see this when Jesus raises the daughter of Jairus from the dead, and there's plenty of other Jewish sources about it, where you would get a public funeral. So people would get out there, they would wail, they would mourn, they would cry, blessed be that, and you mourn for 7 days. You go to the tomb, all that stuff. But in the Mishnah, it says if a criminal has been condemned to death by the court, that is not allowed. You cannot publicly mourn, and you cannot bury them with the family. It has to be in a tomb by the Sanhedrin. And so those two elements that we see, the lack of mourning and the lack of family involvement, are what we see with Joseph. So what I think Joseph is doing is that he's giving the body, he's basically putting lipstick on a corpse. He's technically following the law as it is by not allowing public mourning and not allowing the women to help him, which is strange that the women watch and don't bother to help him unless it's a dishonorable burial. But he's touching it up. He's doing the best he can. And so I think you do get this little gray area here, which I think shows that kind of verisimilitude, the very careful steps you have to take there. But we do see in later Gospels, like the Gospel of Peter, throws that out the window and says, oh yeah, people were mourning, people were crying and wailing that they killed the Son of God, which is anachronistic in that way. And so I think those are less accurate than what we see there, and it pays less attention to that. So that's what I meant when I said it was somewhat dishonorable.
I always find it interesting when people contrast the Gospels with, the canonical Gospels with the Gospel of Peter. Even though Matthew has quite a dramatic, he has an earthquake and he has, an angel coming down, paralyzing the guards. I mean, that seems to be quite mythologized, just almost as much as the Gospel of Peter. I mean, I'm seeing maybe a contrast between Matthew and Mark, but not really, seems to be in the same category.
Well, it's fine. I mean, it's not
mythologized.
Yeah, I mean, but that's not really over relevant to the empty tomb, because those are kind of more incidental details about it. But if I'm talking about mostly Mark anyway than Matthew's, but that'd be a different conversation that way. But I was
And
just on
Mark
it like,
does have the women mourning Jesus, immediately after his death, as he's being, the women are there and they're mourning, presumably.
where does
So,
it say they're mourning?
well, they're there. I mean, do you think, I would imagine that they're mourning. I wouldn't expect them to be laughing or smiling or anything.
No,
You know?
you're allowed to mourn in your heart. It says in the Mishnah 6:5 that you're
Mhm.
allowed to mourn in the heart and in private, but you can't have a public display where it's like, because they would typically, I don't know if you've seen like a New Orleans funeral before, where they have like a procession of musicians and stuff like that, people playing the flute. You'd actually hire people to professionally mourn for you,
Okay.
and that was a whole thing. So the fact that you don't be that with criminals, so the fact that you don't see that when they could have, and you do see that with like the Gospel of Peter, where they just throw that out the window. I think it just implies that and surprising. And I'd also say my opening, I made that argument that I don't see why Christians would want to make up a story of an honorable, or at least a quasi honorable burial to begin with, because I think that it's consistent with the Old Testament passages they're using about the anointed one who they thought was Jesus, being the body being treated badly and all this stuff. And you don't see vindication until after the postmortem, but when it talks about the burial, it's usually used in pretty negative terms, or at least it's not like honorable, like they spit on my body, they show my bones, all that stuff. So I think if they had just been guessing what happened to the body of Jesus, like, oh yeah, maybe he was dishonorable, but look, it says he'll make his grave with the wicked. So that just fulfills the scripture, that just proves it. And of course, they weren't shy about showing Jesus crucified or beaten or whipped, and maybe they even over dramatized it to make it more dramatic. But if Jesus was beaten for your sins and was flogged for it and was crucified, is it really that much of a stretch to say, but we can't have him dishonorably buried? Isn't that just one? Is that too far? Like,
Yeah, I think it would be, considering, how big of a deal burial was back in the ancient world. I mean, it was a way bigger deal than we understand today. There's I don't know if you recall reading the Odyssey. There's a scene where Odysseus is in the underworld, and one of his crew who died at sea is their ghost is there, and their ghost is begging him to give them an honorable burial because they drowned in the water, I guess, something like that. It was a huge thing, because the ancient people believe that if you're not honorably buried, that your soul is tormented in the afterlife.
Well, yeah, that's certainly it's true that burial was important, but I mean, but in the context of the Christians, they also believe that the body was risen and that Jesus was raised from the grave. So I don't know if like being tormented about it would make a difference, because the grave's defeated, right? It's like, oh, this was a temporary setback, but the wounds are healed, the body's up again, and you do see that. I mean, there are texts like the Testament of Job, where Job's kids are destroyed when the house falls on them. They can't find the body, but the kids are up there in heaven, and they're in glory. So you can have a body going missing or unburied, or they don't know what happens, and yet have like post-mortem vindication. So I don't think you really have to invent the burial narrative to supply that in that way. And so I was going to say that if they would make up a burial, I don't see them as, why they would have the women barely involved there, and why it would mostly be Joseph. Even if you're going to include Joseph as a secret follower, why not have the relatives of Jesus involved in it? Why not have the disciples come back? Why not have the mourning? It does seem a little strange in that way. And as I said, most Christian depictions do want to depict it that way, it seems to me. I did want to spend some time about the actual arguments that I had given in terms of the in favor of it, the women, the primitive, and the oscillating. I don't think the oscillating was addressed. That's contingent on the burial. Yeah, go ahead.
Whether, even if it's primitive, which, I mean, that's fine if it's primitive. That doesn't mean that it's true, though. It just means that it was made up earlier than the Gospel of Mark was written, and so it could have been made up in the 40s or 50s,
Yeah, that's true.
I don't think that really does anything,
Yeah, no, I agree that it doesn't prove that it's true. It doesn't prove that it's true, but I do think it's at least some evidence for an early, like, certainly if it was very, very late, that would hurt our confidence. So I think the fact that it's an early tradition, at least around at the time of Paul, right? I do think this does conclude it being a purely Markan invention. Of course, if that tradition was around before Paul, that also means the tradition of Joseph burying the body, because it's kind of contingent on the empty tomb story, right? Or at least being buried in some kind of tomb, was also probably pre-Markan and so forth. So it does just
I think Christians could have made up Jesus' burial by Joseph of Arimathea early, within a few years of his death. It doesn't take very long for Christian, since nobody knew what happened to the body,
Right.
for them to fill that gap with something cool, like, oh wow, a Sanhedrin member, gave him this huge, expensive burial. Since nobody knew what happened to the body, it was very easy to fill that gap. So I think that could have happened early, and I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah, I agree that that doesn't prove it, but I do think that it is at least some evidence. Granted, legends can pop up early, but I'm just saying, like, if it was like a very late tradition that we thought Mark invented, that would certainly hurt our confidence, right? But I'm just saying that it seems plausible that when Paul is talking about this, if there is a story that's around the same time that's circulating about a burial tradition, Paul might be. It's at least consistent with what Paul's referring to there. He may not have that in mind, but if if it's existing the same time, or if it doesn't like predate it, or they're about the same time, there's no reason to think just Occam's razor that's not the same tradition, unless you have another argument for that. So I agree, and that's not my strongest point, but I do think that it is relevant there. About the women, I think it's funny that you thought it's funny that I mentioned that because I know that you didn't like this you don't like this argument as much.
I made a whole post about that recently.
You did, and I wrote a whole blog post about that prior to your post, granted, but
okay.
In that way. But yeah, I think it gets complicated, and I think it's funny that when Dale Allison lists the arguments for and against Imputum, he actually thinks this is the strongest one as well, and he thinks the primitive tradition,
the strongest one.
He thinks it is. Yeah, he ranks it there. I think the strongest one is the Oscilegium one, the secondary burial one, but that does preclude that the burial happened. Where if you agree that the burial is historical, then it seems likely that their Imputum is more likely. But I know that
what's the Oscileum argument again? Remind me.
Oh yeah, that if assuming that this is like granting the burial was in a known location, which I know you don't, like to say that typically it was they would have to go and rebury the bones after the body decomposed and put it in an ossuary. And if it was like in the Jewish cemetery, which we don't know if they were rock cut tombs or in the ground, the families would come and take it and then put it in the family tomb after a year. And so they typically just didn't let the body sit there and rot like we do. They have to move the bones and put it in a place. So if that's the case, the fact that the body's decomposed and stuff like that means someone at some point is going to have to come there and move the bones and put it in the family burial spot. So someone's going to have to visit the tomb and identify the body. So that just seems like it would make that harder to do if the body was like, if the empty tomb wasn't true. Like, is that not going to be an issue that's going to arise where people are like, oh, we actually buried him, last week or something, and is James his brother not going to know about this? Like, it just seems like that just would raise so many more questions unless you just say that complete dissonance.
I'm not sure I understand how this I don't really understand how this is supporting your argument. So are you saying that like this supports that that the body went missing because they did because they didn't find it?
If it hadn't gone missing and the family had come and reburied it, then it seems different. The resurrection would have gotten off the ground among Jesus's, among James or Jesus' followers, if that was if the family had it seems very, especially if Paul's visiting Jerusalem, talking to Peter and James, and that just doesn't come up, or it's like, oh yeah, I buried him last week. Like, it just seems that makes it harder. But if the body's gone, then it would explain why that you didn't have that that practice there.
Right. So, but the family reburies them in the bone box after what, a year, 3 years?
Usually a year or so decomposition.
Yeah, a year. So after a year, I mean, if it was in the ground for a year and it went missing, I mean, I can think of all kinds of different ways that somebody might have dug it up. I mean, a body that's just sitting in the ground could go missing way more easily than in a sepulcher with a stone. Well,
that's fine. That's fine. I'm just saying that if you're conceding the body going missing, I think we're talking about an empty tomb. Granted, I am talking about the sepulcher itself, but I think if the body was buried with a headstone and it comes back and then it was gone, whether it was moved, stolen, or whatever, that's still technically like a missing body tradition that may have given rise to the story we see, right? Like it's not identical, but it would be consistent with that. But I want to talk about the women thing for a second, and we can maybe end on that note. Yeah. So I know your objections were that you said that it's Mark's theme of the last will be first and the first will be last, and that the women typically prepared the body for burial. I'll take the second one first, because I think the first one's the better of the 2 points, because I think that is somewhat plausible. But I don't think that it's even true that women predominantly did, or at least not for male corpses. In the Simachat, it says, a man may shroud and gird the corpse of a man, but not of a woman. A woman may shroud the corpse of a man or a woman. So typically women could do the corpse of either or, and men could do the corpse of men. So This would mean that the woman could do it, but it's not like it's exclusive or that it was like it was expected. Like it's not weird, and that's why Joseph and Arimathea and Nicodemus are the ones who actually wash the body. Like it's not considered out strange. And you do see plenty of times, both in the Old Testament with the burial of Isaac or Jacob and Esau, and in the Gospels with the burial of John the Baptist by his male disciples. It's not like it was like that strange for the men and relatives to bury it. In fact, there's one person who tells Jesus, "Oh, let me go bury my father." He's probably talking about Oselegium there, but still. So the idea that men just weren't involved or wouldn't be the ones to go to the tomb to prepare the body, I think, is just wrong. And so I don't think that precludes women to do that. But the second,
I'll have to look into that further later, because I know Bart Ehrman has stated that that the burial of dead, or the anointing of dead bodies with spices was a woman's job.
Yeah,
I could find you a quote from him, and
I've seen him say that, but I don't know. I'd have to check. I don't remember if he actually gives a source for that though. Because I have seen people that say that, and I'm just saying like literally sources from the New Testament, from Jewish law. So if there are if they actually have something in Jewish law, something that like, then that's fine. I'm just curious because I have not been able to find like an actual primary source where they get that from. I think in the Greek culture that was more common, but in Jerusalem, it seems to me in Judaism it could have been either or. And in terms of the women, the first and last thing, I think that is a fair point. Although I still don't think that actually answers the question, because in Mark's gospel, there are lepers, there are cripples, there are poor people. There's lots of different demographics. So I think if Mark wants to get
lepers come visit the tomb. I mean,
well, the point is like with the
that'd be weird.
Well, it would be, but Mark could have this theme and also not use women, because women were like in the and I think it's Rosh Hashanah or some of the other Talmudic texts. It gives a list of like 10 people who are disqualified generally from giving testimony with certain exceptions, and it's like women, it's slaves, it's children, and it's like dishonest professions.
Yeah, but all the gospel writers except for Mark have men confirm the women's discovery. So I don't see how that hurts, the gospel message. I mean, John and Luke have Peter run to the tomb and confirm it. I mean,
do you think that's because they are uncomfortable with that and they're trying to like, oh no, guys, don't worry, there were men there too, or is that part of it?
Yeah, and even there are ways of getting around getting around the women's testimony thing. I mean, I just don't think that it would hurt the message.
But they are trying to get around it though, right? Because if they're not trying to get around it, they're just saying, "Oh no, yeah, women did it, and that's fine, and we're all feminists here, and that's not an issue that women." Or is it saying, "Well, oh, women did it. Well, no, the male disciples were there too, guys. That it wasn't just them." Like that seems like they're uncomfortable with that and trying to cover it up. But even given that case, though, the male disciples check that the tomb's empty, but none of them see the burial though. So they're still relying on the woman's testimony that he was buried in the right spot. Because the women could say, "We found this tomb empty, and we think we saw Jesus buried there," and oh look, the men confirmed it too. But that doesn't mean the men. It could be that the women went to the wrong tomb and the men falsely believed them and trusted them and didn't see it for themselves. And they saw the tomb empty, but they didn't see the burial. So why should they're still trusting the woman there, and the woman could be incompetent and be wrong or anything like that, be easily deceived, right? So it does help a little bit. But when you look at the gospel, I hate to keep referencing the gospel, Peter. What he does is he has a bunch of Roman soldiers and Jews waiting outside the tomb, like for it to happen, and then he raises it from everyone. And the women come after the fact and see it, and it's kind of like redundant because like everyone saw the little resurrection, right? So I think there's so many ways you can conceive of that for that to happen without having to have that situation there. So I'm not saying there's like no reason Mark could have done it, but I'm just saying I feel like it's a stretch, and it's I could still think of ways that Mark could have done it without needing to include them. And I think it's just more risky for him to do that. And the fact that other gospels are uncomfortable with this.
But how is it risky though? See, I've never really understood this. Like I understand the argument, but I don't really understand how this argument is supposed to be. Like, it's not embarrassing for women to discover your tomb empty per se, like just by itself. That's not embarrassing. I mean, so is the argument that like it would have been less convincing to people if they heard the gospel and then you said, oh, women discovered it first, and so they're less likely to think, oh, this is real? Is that the argument?
The argument is that like if you're giving a claim of, oh, we found a tomb empty and then saw a dead person, and it's like, and yes, women were the first ones to find it. They told us this was the tomb of Jesus, and they told us we were going to see the dead person, and we saw the risen one. And it's like, oh, the women were the ones who originally told you that you were going to see Jesus and found the tomb empty. If Mary Magdalene's the first one to see it, at least, or whatever. But that raised a lot of questions in terms of like they would have. That's almost like if I did a story and I said, oh yes, the mentally ill person, was the one who originally saw the ghost, and that's why you
Right.
should believe.
But then the ghost appeared to 12 people who all saw it. Right.
Who were influenced by, who were contaminated by the women, right? Who originally were told to expect this. Yeah, because
I
go
don't get
tell
it.
Peter that he
I really don't.
go.
Yeah, because if somebody said, okay, so maybe Jesus didn't rise from the dead because it was women that reported his tomb empty, then the Christian would just say, Jesus appeared to his 12 disciples, he appeared to 500 people, blah blah blah. It's not just women discovering the tomb. That was, and even in the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, Paul doesn't even mention the women. So you didn't need to mention the women part if you're trying to convince somebody that the gospel is true. You know?
Yeah, well, I think
you convince them first, and then they read the gospels, and then they,
I think the Paul thing is about, like, he's talking about who was commissioned by Jesus, not just who appeared. But that's kind of a different scenario in terms of why he's listing certain people, why he's not.
The 1 Corinthians 15 creed is more likely to be what would be quoted to non-Christians who you're trying to convince, right?
Mm-hmm.
Rather than like reading the whole gospel story to them. Because most Christians back then didn't even have access to the Gospels.
Sure, but they're not just citing the creed. I mean, Paul says, "I tell you what you already knew," and he gives a shortened version of it. But like, it's not like that's
passing this around.
The creed, yeah. But surely there was more to the creed other than just, like it says he was crucified. It never says he was crucified by Pontius Pilate, right?
Mm-hmm.
It says he was buried. It never says he was buried by Joseph of Arimathea. Like the fact that it's just a very brief, he was dead, buried. You say you believe in the crucifixion, burial, resurrection. He's giving a summary of it, but that doesn't mean that there's not more. As if people
that's all that was needed to convince people. That's all that was needed to summarize the Christian
people would have asked questions about, like, but what, I mean, even the Corinthians are asking, but what kind of body is resurrected? And you don't think that this would have been like pertinent of like all the details of like which would have not cared? It just seems strange to me. But yeah,
I don't think that reading the gospel to people would have been the first like initial thing that most Christians would have done when trying to convince their non-believing neighbor. I don't think they had the gospel available to read to people. This was before the printing press, obviously. And by the time the gospels were written, most, there was already a very sizable Christian population. I just don't see how having that detail about the women discovering the tomb empty would have hurt the Christian message at all. By the time it was written down, Christianity was already popular.
Right, which is that's why I said earlier that it was primitive and probably predates the actual writing of it. So this would have been circulating oral tradition probably well before Mark was written, though. So I do think it still predates that when Christianity.
Paul already had like 20 churches by the time.
I mean, sure, but that creed existed before Paul did too. I mean, when he's getting it.
How do we know that?
Well, because he said he received it.
The creed. Okay, I thought you were talking about the.
No, I'm saying that. Yeah, right. The creed. But I'm saying they predate. Sure, yeah. But with the thing about the non-believers, so that's why granted I didn't read it because I was going really fast. But with Celsus, you do have them where they make that comment about who saw this, and it's funny because the way you say that's actually what Celsus said, because he says, "Who beheld this Mary Magdalene? Oh, a half frantic woman, as you state," and then it says that Origen says, "Oh, but there were others as well," and then Celsus says, "Oh, someone else who's been infected with the same delusion," and then elsewhere he says the Christian story is one that only slaves and women and children and stupid people believe at that point. So there is a stigma there, and it's funny because when Dale Allison talked about this, he does something that I haven't seen anyone else do, which is when he tracks the history of this argument up until about the 1800s. Every time this was brought up, it was always by the skeptic side. You had 17th century German critics who were saying like, oh, women saw these phantasms and great things, and that this is just proof of delusion. And you do see this in Celsus and other places. And it's not until the rise of feminism in the 1800s that you say, oh, wait a minute, this is actually an argument in favor of it, and it's embarrassing. And so Christians didn't seem to be using this as oh, no, guys, like you should believe women and it's not a problem. It seemed like Christians, every time this was brought up, were being defensive and saying, well, there were other people there, and kind of just trying to like throw another rug and ignore it rather than like defending it, So I think it just shows there's discomfort there. And as I said, it's just more risky. Like there's just, I don't see any real positive argument for it. So although,
but like I said, most Christians didn't have access to the Gospels.
Right, but I'm talking about the oral traditions that predate the Gospels that these were based on.
Yeah, but since most Christians didn't have access to the Gospels, the women testimony wouldn't have discouraged, converts, because it wouldn't have been on anybody's mind,
Right, but I'm saying that Christians who were converting, who were learning about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and that was that could have precluded them. That could have been a stumbling block, in many ways. There's already enough stumbling blocks, Paul says, in many ways in that way. But I think with that we can go to unless you have anything else you wanted to say. Like, I think this is a good way to.
Yeah.
I think we covered everything on the list, at least that I had. If Neil wants to go to questions, or if you have anything else.
There's one more thing.
Yeah.
I was hoping we could get this one more thing, and then we can go to questions. I hope you're not tired of this by now, but the Deuteronomy 21 thing. I just had a thought. Like, okay, so if a Roman was crucifying somebody overnight, and they and then the next morning it was found that they were dead. Would there be any indication of when they died? Like, how do you know that they died? And that there was a dead body left overnight? How do you know they didn't just die? Once the sun came up, there's no way to say, oh, well, this person died while it was still dark, and so the dead body was left on the cross overnight. There'd be no way to make that an issue. The Romans could just say, we don't know when they died. We noticed they were dead when flies started buzzing.
Right. Which is why you could just kill them before the night, just to make sure. You could just be certain. You'll just kill them before and bury them. You don't have to worry about.
Against Roman practices, and it would defeat the whole purpose of crucifixion.
Okay, there's nowhere in Roman law that says, like, you shall not do it earlier. Like, it was standard practice. We don't know if it was standard practice in Jerusalem. I don't think there's any textual evidence for that prior to 70.
Yeah, but it defeats the whole purpose of crucifixion, which was to prolong the agony for as long as possible.
Right, but again, that's going to be contingent on the area you're doing it and the context in which you're doing it. And if they're doing this in a way where, apparently Pilate, wasn't even like big on, like, Jesus must, according to Mark at least, Jesus must suffer, and I want him to suffer as long as possible. Like, even if he was reluctant,
he's a seditionist.
He was a seditionist, but he was also a philosopher king whose kingdom was not of this world, right? So he's like, okay, this guy is kind of just delusional, but he's not a threat. So I don't see that, if according to the Gospels, of that being a major issue. I don't think Pilate was just super eager to have him dead, and Pilate was even surprised when, according to Mark, that Jesus died so quickly. But he was like,
I just don't see any reason, like, why. Okay, you're a Roman soldier. You're guarding these crucified, peasants, and who are committing sedition against the empire. All right, so what's the reason to break their legs, and hasten their death? I just don't see any, because it's not that the Jews will riot if you don't, because the Jews won't tell the difference, because the Jews won't know when they died.
But it's just having the body up there in general is that like here, let me just read you when Josephus says they actually went so far in their enmity as to cast out the corpses without burial. He's talking about, this is during the war, though the Jews are so careful about funeral rites that even malefactors who have been sentenced to crucifixion are taken down and buried before sunset.
Yeah, but that's when Jews are the ones doing the crucifying, not when the Romans are doing the crucifying. When the Jews are doing the crucifying, then they have the ability to take them down whenever they want.
Josephus was not alive at a time where Jews do. The only time Jews crucified was a particular king, like I forget his name, who crucified like 700
during the Maccabean revolt. Yeah.
Well, no, that was that Maccabean revolt. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're right. That's part of that. Yeah, that's it. But Josephus is talking about, I think, within his own time, because Josephus is saying that when the body, because in the context he's saying that during the war they would kill bodies and leave them upright, and that horrified people, because like, oh my gosh, they're leaving bodies unburied. This is so strange, because usually we bury them. And so these are people in the generation. If it's saying, oh yeah, people have always been unburied since the Maccabean ages, then these people have been used to it. Like, oh yeah, bodies are left unburied. We see the Romans do it all the time. This is saying, oh, this is strange. Like they're leaving bodies unburied. We've always known bodies to be buried. And so I feel like he's talking about his generation, his lifetime.
Well, he's contrasting the Jews with these other people. And so when Jews have the power.
He's talking about the Jews who were seeing the bodies left unburied during the war, who would have been alive in the earlier decades, like around his generation. And they were shocked to see that. He's not to say that they like historically knew of a time in which they did it when the Jews crucified, but they've always grown up seeing Romans leaving people unburied. Just doesn't really make sense of the quote, I would say. But
I don't know about that.
Neil, you still there?
Yeah, I'm just making sure you guys are duking it all out and making sure everything's settled out. And
I think we're having fun. I like Steven. He's a
yeah, I've been enjoying.
You made some interesting arguments. I'll give you that.
Thank you. You too.
Got a lot to think about.
Definitely.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So
You too.
are you guys done cross examination? You want to do
I
questions?
think we covered everything
Yeah.
that I had written down at least.
There's
But
a lot of questions from super chats, and then
Okay.
when you guys who don't have if the people who don't have super chats, just well, as soon as you see me read that last super chat out, you can start asking questions after that, and I'll see them.
Mhm.
All
Okay.
right. So let's see. The first one, where is it? Gaius Julius Windex. Do you think it's more likely that Jesus was left in the cross and then thrown into a pit west of Jerusalem, the garbage pit, Tartarus?
I think that's for Stephen, because obviously,
Okay.
my
Well, this okay. There's several things that are kind of being mixed together here. So there's this idea that there was this garbage pit. That was what was the name of it again?
Tartarus.
Gehenna.
Gehenna.
Yeah. That's actually a misconception. Bart Ehrman talks about this in his book Heaven and Hell. It was never a garbage pit. The reason that this valley was cursed was because there was an instance where a man sacrifices his children there. But there's no evidence that it was ever a garbage pit. I think that. Do I think that it's more likely Jesus was left on the cross and then thrown into the pit? I don't think that he was thrown there. I think that really, I think it's 50-50 whether Jesus was left on the cross and eaten by scavenging animals or whether he was thrown into a criminal's, mass grave. I think it's 50-50. I don't really. I'm on the fence about the arguments that the Jews would have revolted if there was bodies left on the crosses. I don't think that the Jews would have revolted and mobbed just because of that. I think that they were used to it. It was what Romans did, and they accepted it as an unpleasant reality. That's my opinion.
Yeah, and obviously I don't think it is, but I actually agree with Stephen that in Barnum, I don't think that that from my understanding, I don't think Gehenna was a garbage pit in that way. Because I think,
and it wasn't called Tartarus either. Tartarus was the hell in Greek mythology.
Yeah.
So that's why I said several things being like kind of mixed together here.
And just a clarification of what Stephen said. I know we don't have to go back and forth on these, but it's not just that. I mean, yet it's not just that they were unburied, which is one thing, but it's also that it was on Passover, which would have been an even bigger offense, and it was also. Oh my gosh, I completely blanked out on. Oh yeah, and I was just going to say the leaving a body unburied in Judaism was probably the worst thing you could do, other than having a pig sacrifice in the temple. Like in terms of offensiveness, it was right up there. And there are rabbis who say burial takes precedent over the Sabbath and all that stuff. So the fact that Jews got upset about much less like an idol or a shield being put in Jerusalem and were willing to threaten a riot. I think a body being left out there would have been far, far of a bigger offense, but I'll just leave it at that.
And me and Derek went to the Valley of Hinnom. We went there. And, pretty nice. It was like a nice park. You could walk through, and it was,
Yeah, I've been there too.
Cool Church of the Holy Sepulchre as well.
Oh yeah, we
and the Garden Tomb, which nobody thinks the Garden Tomb is legitimate.
We had James Tabor as our guide, so we did.
Oh man,
everything. We did everything.
That's so cool.
It was great. Anyways, is that you guys done with this question?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Next one is from Salvation. Is it possible they stole the body?
I don't know who they is, but yes.
Okay. This actually, we didn't get to this in the debate, but another possibility that I've considered. People say, okay, the disciples wouldn't have stolen the body because they were martyred. People don't die for a lie. One thing that I don't think that people consider very often is that some of the disciples stole the body and not all of them knew about it. Because you can't consider the disciples to be a monolith. They weren't all one group with one mind or something. Some of the disciples may have stolen it and convinced the others that it was a resurrection in order to continue the movement. This, I don't know how plausible this is, but it's something that I don't hear people talk about that I think should be on the table.
Anything's possible. It's possible, but
Right. I don't even disagree with Stephen on that to be, which is weird. Like, obviously I don't think it was, but in terms of historical plausibility, I'll even do you one better. I think more plausible than that would be, instead of the 12, it could be, Luke mentions there are 70 other disciples, like not the main ones.
Yeah.
We don't know anything about these people. Like, how do you know that one of them didn't do it, never said anything, we never hear from them again? Like, we can't rule that out. Dale Allison and Richard Carrier, this is before Carrier was a mythicist, said that it's plausible that the body could have been stolen by a third party, by even sorcerers, because stealing body parts for certain recipes was common for them breaking the tombs. And so, granted, in Jerusalem that was maybe less common, but it's still plausible. So I actually recommend his article, Carrier's article, on the plausibility of theft. And I say that as someone who doesn't usually agree with Carrier, but I think that's the best alternative, I would say. And I think it's hard to rule that out historically. So that's my honest answer. But yeah, I think the body could have been stolen. It could have also been moved by Joseph. Maybe he temporarily buried him and moved him to a different place earlier. I think that's less likely, though, because I don't think he would do it at night. I don't think he would leave his tomb just hanging with the door open where animals get inside and stuff like that. It looks like it was hacked into. So I think that's less likely, but still there.
Yeah.
So.
Interesting.
I also don't think it's likely that there were guards in front of the tomb. I think that
yeah.
Most
would agree.
Why would you, like, think about the resources? Like, you have your guards all the way out there in Jerusalem, and there's so many limited resources than what you want to guard. Why some random body of some criminal?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
For how long? Like a week, a year?
even for a day. Like, why?
Yeah.
Do they care what happens to the body? We got one
body. I have written a blog article on the guards, and I come out agnostic on it because I think I don't really find the arguments against it persuasive, but I think the arguments for it are also speculative. So if you pinned me down and said pick something in the Gospels you think is like probably legendary, I think the guards is a good place to go, and that's most.
Unless this is some really nice tomb region, like part of the city where there's a lot of tombs, and in that case they have guards guarding everything.
Well,
then the question would be, why is Jesus allowed to go to this place? I mean, he just got killed. He's a criminal. Why would they want him to be in this section?
Right. Well, Josephus does mention there are guards in front of the temple during Passover because they were worried about riots and wanted, like, basically hyping up security, right? And that way. So it's what is interesting is that you do have references like people saying John the Baptist or some dead. You have Pilate. You have Pilate taking out. This is after Jesus, but taking out someone who claimed to be the reincarnation of Moses, who was a Samaritan. You have a story, I think it's in Tacitus, or maybe it's in Cassius too, I forget, where someone steals the body of his owner and pretends to be him. And you have people impersonating Nero after he dies and pretending to be him. So surprisingly, it was more common than you think that people were moving bodies and pretending to be people. And that being a more common problem that we would think in terms of records. So if there was rumors of maybe this guy's maybe they're going to fake a resurrection, they're going to try to do this and start something. Maybe Pilate could have been concerned about that, but that is speculation. I agree. So
this happened with Alexander the Great. When Alexander died in Babylon, the plan was take him back to Macedonia, where he could go with where his father and the kings of Macedonia are. And Ptolemy, who was set up in Egypt, came up and intercepted the casket and brought it back down to Egypt. So bodies the idea of bodies being stolen and moved around, it looked no farther than Alexander's story for that one.
Right, and if someone as big as Alexander, who would have secured all that stuff, can get moved, Jesus is relatively less important. I mean, even if you go by the Gospels, so it's not. But that doesn't affect whether the tomb is empty or not. You can say it wasn't. It was full, and that's so we're not talking about why it was empty. So.
Right. Thank you for that super chat. Imposter Suspense, thank you for the super chat. It's all Orphic imagery. Orpheus was ripped apart and sang hymns as he died. Jesus was ripped apart, crucifixion, and sang hymns. I guess that is. They performed rites the night before. Caleb, do you doubt?
Do I doubt what? That's what happened, or
what did you? Yeah, I guess.
Is this a parallel to Orphic mystery religions? Like, is that what this is saying? Like, it's more just mythical in that way.
This person, I've thrown this out there as a admittedly stretch, but I do think it's interesting how Orpheus, when he's dying, he's singing hymns, and Jesus is on the cross. If you go to all four of the Gospels, they're all something from Psalms.
Right.
Psalms are songs.
Right.
Like,
Yeah, I don't think it was uncommon for especially rabbis to be singing hymn, like especially psalms while they were dying. Especially the Lord is my shepherd. I shall like what more
something
perfect one would
sad
have?
like that, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it was common. I'd have to look in the Talmud or the Mishnah for that, but I'm fairly confident that was not, and it's not like implausible that someone would be singing hymns, right? And so you can do that. But no, I don't think that I do think there was a tradition. I'm surprised this actually wasn't brought up. I think one of the best arguments against the empty tomb would be that you do have mythical story, at least we presume mythical, of bodies going missing, of people being assumed into heaven. Richard C. Miller talks about this a lot. And although I think that's relevant, I would say, first of all, I think the traditions of that are a lot later than you have for Jesus. And also, I don't think that in those cases, the body would have been put in a known burial place, or in a culture with burial of also legium, like I said with Jesus. So I think the circumstances are different there. And I think that even if you concede that, the fact that you have parallels doesn't necessarily mean that they're inventing this from the parallels. It's just as plausible to say that if a body went missing, their minds go, well, I know if bodies get moved, I know if bodies are missing, he must be in heaven, he must be God, right? So if the body does go missing, that might as well just be as much of the cause for them to believe the resurrection than saying that they started with the myths and invented it. So I don't think it helps. I think it's equally plausible that they could have been inspired by these and invented it versus could have believed in the resurrection because the body went missing and thought back and said that's the thing they're working with. That's a social thing they're working with. I think the evidence I presented that I argued makes the second one more likely, given that as a symmetry breaker. So that's what I would say.
All right. Thank you for that super chat. Let's see what else we got.
Super chat of $10. Is that these people aren't going cheap. It's good.
No, that was a good one. Thank you for that. I appreciate it a lot. Thank you. Yakuv, thank you for the super chat. Caleb, can you point to where the so-called tomb is? I live here. We have like 20 spots. We have like 20 spots that claim to be it. Only rich were buried in tombs.
Well, you already said that in the debate. You think it was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
Yeah, I did. I mean, there's three
Someone
main.
wasn't listening.
I know the 20 is like a little bit of an exaggeration. He probably is being hyperbolic. There's
a few. There's a couple. Yeah, I was there. We went to the different spots, and
the main ones are the Garden Tomb, the Holy Sepulchre, and the Talpiot Tomb. The Talpiot Tomb is the least popular because besides James Tabor, typically. I don't know if hardly any archaeologist who thinks the Garden Tomb is right because it's way too old and it's probably like from the 800s BC and it's chiseled wrong and all that stuff. It looks nice.
The 5th century.
Do you know where the
Talpiot?
Do you know where the Talpiot tomb is right now? Like what it looks like?
I know what it looks like. Yeah, in terms of like where in Jerusalem it's located.
There is no site. It's completely paved over. There's a house there. You can't. It's not there anymore. It's not a site that people go to find.
Yeah, it's not even like it's out of the way for a second.
Residential house. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Did James Tabor talk to you about that when he was guiding you?
Yeah, we went there.
Yeah, like did he talk to you about why he thinks that it's authentic?
Kinda.
Yeah, he's not like dogmatic about it or anything.
Okay.
Yeah, he explained like what the theories are and why.
Uh-huh. A lot of it's based on like statistics that I am too dumb to understand and there's some on both sides where they say like the number of, because there's a James that's found in there, but it's debated whether it was in that one or a different one. And there's names that match up with it where it's like, oh, if it's all of these names, Mary and all that stuff, it can't be, it has to be that, or it's like statistically likely it is. But then other people say, well, no, those names are very common. You have other names like Matthias and Judah that aren't even in the New Testament that don't make sense. And I think that some people think those are Jesus's kids, that he married Mary Magdalene, all that stuff. So it's a lot of speculation in terms of that being accurate, but
in his book, he quoted one of the scientists who analyzed the microorganisms and the what do you call it, the engraving to see if it was really really old or whether it was pasted there or something like that. And the scientist apparently said something like, "If it's not authentic, I quit."
I've heard people say about the Shroud of Turin, funny enough, too. So I don't know how much weight that holds, but
yeah, I don't know. It made me interested.
Yeah, that's an interesting super chat though. And so yeah, I guess Caleb, your answer is that you can't point to the spot. We don't know where the spot is, right? At least you would say that.
Well, the actual like tomb spot is underneath I forget like the edicule. And when you go there, you see the burial bed, and it's underneath. That's not the actual burial bed because people kept touching it.
You're talking about the where it is not. Like he's talking. I think this person's asking like, where's the tomb that the empty tomb was? Like, where is the actual? Oh, so you think I thought they don't know where that is?
Well, I think it's, I mean, to my understanding, I believe it's underneath the Edicule. Like it's kind of like a cave, but it was like chipped away, but they built that giant church on top of it. So I don't know if you went inside the Edicule.
That's the one. That's the one that. That's the one that. What's her name found? Constantine's
Helena.
Yeah.
Yeah, Helena.
I don't think that's. Well, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think that's like. I don't know if that's like that much source. I don't know how well done. I don't think that's really.
Actually, it's not great. Archaeologically, it's fairly strong. And that seems to be like the general consensus among most archaeologists. And I cited off a couple, but in terms of that, I think certainly it's more likely than like the Bethlehem Church or the other ones that just they picked a spot and had like virtually no basis for it. But
yeah, James Tabor in his book said that he thinks that that was the tomb of John Hyrcanus.
Yeah, I have not heard that theory before, so I don't have much of a comment on it.
I gotta look into that. That's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah. He was a very interesting or very, very important person for the priesthood and stuff, because that was the time of, was it the first Hyrcanus or the second Hyrcanus? Because that was the time it's Julius Caesar when he got appointed, when they conquered the East. Pompey conquers the East, and then they let Jerusalem stay as its own priesthood, and then then Caesar, who was the high priest, he just got elected as Pontifex Maximus in 63. Same year Augustus was born too. It's a crazy year. And he appointed Hyrcanus to be the high priest and said, you guys can keep your priesthood, and you guys can even have your Sabbath and all that. Just make sure you keep tribute. And deal, obviously. So that's interesting that would be his tomb right there. I like that. I like that. But thank you for that. Yeah, salvation with another one. Christ's resurrection is the only likely scenario. We know that Joseph of Arimathea was historical. Is that true? No. Stephen, did you think that Arimathea is not a real place?
He spelled it.
Oh, you know what?
Typed it out.
Well, it is a real place.
Okay, so I'm on the fence about whether Joseph of Arimathea was historical. Maurice Casey actually identifies Arimathea as, I forget what he identifies it as.
In 1 Samuel, I think.
Yeah, right.
Well, so, there might be a pun, because Dennis McDonald was saying that in Greek, Arimathea says good disciple.
Richard Carrier says that it means best disciple town, but I don't.
Yeah,
from what
I've heard that too.
Looking at academic Bible Reddit, which I know is only somewhat credible, when people there was a question about that, and they said like it's loosely translated that way, but you kind of have to stretch it, like it's a little bit of a way. But Ramath, but I don't think it has much significance. Like Luke even says it was a Jewish town because like no one had ever heard of it. Like it's mentioned briefly, or Ramath is mentioned by, I think it's mentioned by Eusebius, I think it's mentioned by Josephus in like 1 Samuel, but it's like not a very significant town. So which actually is interesting, that the fact that the tomb would have been new if he was from Arimathea, like that's because usually you think his family tomb would be in Arimathea, so they had just like moved, or if it was a first generation thing. I don't know. Maybe that's why Matthew says it was new. I don't know, but that's just thought that came to mind. So it's interesting though. But yeah, I think
I'm on the fence about whether which argument, because I've heard both of them and they both sound plausible. So I don't really have a firm position either way.
Yeah, and in terms of we know Joseph's historical, I don't think historically we don't. The way we can prove or disprove that, like it's. I'm my kind of thing is like, why not? Like I think it's consistent, and it's kind of one of those where it's like I don't think I have a good reason to disbelieve it. So it's like, sure, I think it's plausible in terms of like the name, but I don't think we can know that in terms of like we can know Jesus was crucified. Like I don't think it's that confident. So if I'm being honest, but
yeah, thank you for that. Samantha Jennings says, "Why did Jesus get vinegar on the cross?"
It's a little off topic, but it's thirsty.
Yeah, I heard that. I thought, isn't it like a somewhat pain relief, something like that?
Maybe
some kind of anesthetic or something.
Who Neil? Who wrote? Do you know who wrote the Passover plot? Do you know what I'm talking about? I forget his name. Starts with an S.
I'm not sure.
Schaller. He thinks Jesus like faked a lot, or was trying to fake his reresurrection, and that they had
Scofield,
Scofield, yeah, and they had laced the vinegar with like a drug to make him look passed out, and then it was, but then the spear happened, and like, oh shoot, no, it ruined our plan. It's really entertaining to read, but that's maybe he would probably say because it was drugged, but
yeah, you're dealing with stories that are heavily mythologized. It's like, what are we doing here? Like, why is there all this guessing on what the text is and guessing what actually happened? But also, Oh, and there's also the Dennis McDonald thinks it's a mimesis. And he
Mhm.
thinks that
Mimesis.
when Hector is dying,
Mhm.
when Hector's dying, they give him wine too.
Oh, okay.
So he thinks
It also might just be to fulfill prophecy in Psalms, because it says, they gave me sour wine to drink or something like that.
There you go.
So it might just be that, to fulfill
There you go.
prophecy.
Good
So,
good catch. Thank you for that.
yeah. hmm I
Yellow
forget which Psalm that is.
Yellow Psych. Thoughts on Jesus being stoned in the Talmud?
So that's talking about Yeshua, the sorcerer, being stoned in the Talmud on Passover Eve, I believe, is what he's probably referring to, right?
That's what the text says. He's ordered to be stoned, but then it says right after that, then he was hung on Passover Eve.
Which and hung could mean I think the word there can mean crucified, because you're hanging, right?
Hung on a tree would be crucifixion in Hebrew.
Hung on a tree, yeah, like Galatians, Deuteronomy 21, it talks about hanging on a tree and after the body's been dead. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know how reliable the Talmud is, given like the dating of it in terms of like if that's a later tradition. I know some people want to put that earlier, but I do think the Gospels do mention a couple of times where they attempt to stone him and he gets away. So I don't know if there's a memory there where they would have preferred to stone him, and then but they weren't able to do this. Like, I'm not sure, but you do see a little bit of that there. But whether that's talking about Jesus or about something else, I'm not sure, because Yeshua is a very common name, but they do call him a sorcerer and they do kill him on Passover.
You do say his mother's name is Mary, who
one out of 4 women back then was named Mary. I mean, that doesn't mean much. But it could be.
Okay, you add that to his name being Jesus, to being a sorcerer, to leading Israel astray. All of a sudden, now you're
Passover. Yeah, I agree. I think it probably is talking about Jesus, but
but who knows? Who knows? There's a lot of.
I mean, Jesus pissed off both the Romans and the Jews, so it's possible that the Jews were talking about stoning him, and then some of them were like, you know what, let's deliver him to the Romans, and they'll crucify him.
Yeah,
it could have been something like that.
Maybe.
Plus, they weren't really allowed. I mean, the Babylonian Talmud mentions they weren't really allowed to do an official execution, which is probably why they brought him over to the Romans. Now they do try to do. I mean, Stephen was stoned in a mob riot, but it's not like an official formal trial. So
right,
I think that would have been different. That's why it's complicated politically in terms of who can kill who and all that stuff. But
it is very complicated. That's a good point.
Interesting.
Max, the confessor in the house. Caleb, do you think Neil's? Oh, this. So my God, I don't know if you know this. The God-fearer Hypsisterian. This is a.
I have no idea what that is.
So this is. I'll have to tell you about this then. So this is a group of Greeks in the 1st century to the 4th century. They show up in all these different sources from the 1st to the 4th century, and they're Greeks. They're not Christians, but they're Greek monotheists. Okay. They worship Theos Hypsistos, which in Greek is God Most High, and there's some evidence that shows that they're Septuagint fans. So they like the Jewish religion, but they're not following the laws at all. And so my theory, I put this together in one of my videos. I think the people that Paul are writing to are these people. You ever wonder, how does Paul have the network of churches already, only decades after Jesus is dead? Where do they come from? So I think that solves that.
You think that they were Greek monotheists, basically? They
were 100%. And then if you look at Acts 17, he's like, "Oh, I see you guys have this unknown God. I see your God fear."
You're saying those are the people who would have converted to Christianity first because it would have been the most appealing to them.
That's what I think. And so the question Max is asking is, do you think this connection increases the probability of the evidence of Nicaea 2 being endorsable? I don't even know when Nicaea 2 is, to be honest. Do you know?
I don't think so. They were basically Noahide and followed the 3rd commandment, but made statues, icons. Yeah, it's a little off topic, and I'm not entirely. I'm sad that they paid that much money, and I don't have a good answer because I generally just don't. I'm not well read in what this is, and I can't give you an answer. I do appreciate the Bayesian built with the P probability of hypothesis given evidence. So I do like that. So.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe it's referring to the Second Council of Nicaea.
Yeah, that was my guess. I was going to say that. This is and Max is Orthodox, by the way. Max is Christian, so.
The confessor, I could have probably guessed that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have any thoughts on that, or?
I unfortunately just haven't read enough, and I don't like giving my opinion on things I just don't that I don't know what I'm talking about. So I unfortunately don't have much of an answer.
Anything on for you, Stephen, or no?
Yeah, I don't really have an answer either.
Yeah, Max, you're always going too deep with this. You're always
I appreciate the effort though.
Max is always tossing out the like PhD level, like, here, write a 5-page paper on this, like. But thank you, Max, for and thanks for invoking one of my videos in that question too. Thank you. Let's see. Ted Francis, thanks for your super chat. If Pilate killed Jesus, then the tomb narrative makes no sense. Romans don't listen to Jews; they show power. Pilate was the
Totally agree.
Thoughts, Caleb?
Yep.
Yeah, well, I mean, we kind of covered this in the actual discussion, right, in terms of that. But I'll just say that if I have a few quotes here, Philo in Legation ad Gaium, I'm sorry, I'm butchering that. If anyone knows Latin, 301 says, the honor of the emperor is not identical with dishonor to the ancient laws. Emperor Tiberius is not desirous that any of our laws, the Jewish laws, or customs be destroyed. Josephus in Against Apion says, the Romans do not require their subjects to violate their national laws, which would include early references to leaving a corpse unburied. And Julius Caesar, I'm sorry, yeah, sorry, not Julius Caesar. Caesar Augustus had an edict that said the Jews shall use their own customs in accordance with their ancestral law, and their sacred offerings shall be inviolable and shall be sent to Jerusalem and shall be paid for by financial compensation. And so I think all the textual evidence we have, or at least most of it, does incline that way, including references to explicit crucifixion, burial by Josephus and Pilate out of respect for Jewish laws. So I just don't see any reason to deny that.
Any thoughts on that, Stephen? You agree?
Yeah, and like I said earlier, I don't think that, there's a way to tell, specifically when somebody dies on the cross, when the flies start buzzing, and it starts stinking, that's a pretty good indication, but that they've been dead for a while. But, you can't have, I don't think Jews would be rioting, if they found a body on the cross in the morning and, thought, well, maybe that body was left here overnight, because they don't know.
And I wanted to, and while we're on the subject of like the tomb and stuff, the idea, like the spot that people think there is today, where Constantine's wife, or the empress, supposedly
his mother, but
the reason a red flag to me about this is, well, first of all, how much time has gone by, and all of a sudden it's discovered by someone who's not even from there, and who's really who has a lot of interest to find this, by the way, who needs to find this. And number two is the cross is there. Why would the cross be there?
Yeah.
Why would they bring the cross?
Right.
You're taking off the cross. What, they're going to bring the whole cross to the tomb? That doesn't make any sense. So I just have to. That's my personal thoughts on that.
I can't speak on the cross, but I will just say I think it's we have to be careful with using the word like discovered, because she talks to the Jerusalem bishops and they say, oh, it's underneath this temple that's been here since the 2nd century that Hadrian built because people were venerating it. And so she learned of this partially through that as well. So it's not like it's just oh, look, here's a tomb, guys. That's where the cross is. Like they allegedly said there was a tradition of bishops passing this on since at least the late 1st century. So I'll just say that.
Okay, well, Hadrian would be 2nd century, but anyways.
Hadrian built the temple in the 2nd century, but Christians were allegedly venerating it prior to that, which is why he built the temple in the early 2nd century. So that's why it's a late 1st century. But the bishops actually go back to from 40 to 350 or whatever it was, like in terms of the actual bishop.
I'll look into that. It's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah,
definitely. Pay attention. Okay. And then any more thoughts on this one? We got one more after this, and then we'll go to some.
If Christians were venerating it, it might have been that they were venerating the tomb of John Hyrcanus, like James Tabor thinks, because they needed something. After the gospel stories that that said that Jesus was buried in a fancy tomb, they went looking for this tomb and found a tomb and started venerating that. But I mean, I don't know how much evidence there is that Christians actually were venerating anything.
Yeah,
I'll have to look into that further.
Good point. Thank you for the super chat. Jesus never got crucified. His brother Judas went.
Wow. First of all, brother Judas. Yeah, it's like there's so much from
the 12ers sect.
Yeah. Don't the Muslims say that it was Simon?
I don't know. I know a friend of mine who's from Lebanon. He's a 12er, Shia 12er. He thinks this. He said this is exactly what happened.
Did they mean Judas Iscariot, or did they mean Judas, the brother of Jesus? Like one of the brothers of Jesus is named Judas, I think, in the list, right? Is that what they mean?
He told me
Judas.
I don't know if the guy in the super chat thinks this or not, but my friend Ali told me that Judas was the twin brother of Jesus that was identical.
Yeah. Judas Didymus.
Thomas would be, because Thomas Didymus is the twin, right? That's interesting.
Oh, I think that his name is Judas Thomas. Judas Thomas. Like I think it's a double name.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So that's one of the traditions, I guess. I don't know when that
maybe he went to India afterwards. It's funny. Japan has. I forgot. There's actually we said that the three main tombs. There's actually a fourth one in Japan. I'm not kidding, because they say that Jesus had a Japanese brother and had a very Japanese name, who was crucified in his place. He became a rice farmer in Japan. And before his ministry, he had been to Japan, and that's where he learned like ninja and Shintoism. That's where he got the miracle powers, right? And we know, and he's buried. He was there as a garlic farmer, died at the age of 102, and has a spot there. And we know all this from documents that Jesus himself wrote in Japanese that we found. Now, yes, the carbon dating shows that they date to the 1800s, but that's not relevant to the tradition. Okay,
don't. So Jesus not only spoke Latin and Greek, but also Japanese
and Japanese, and his brother was named like Hirohito or something. It's like, wow, that's a really Japanese sounding name for a first century Jew.
But what I was just thinking is the Islamic tradition of the brother going. I actually think that goes back to some Gnostic sources from Egypt, which would make sense because Arabia and Egypt are just right across the sea from each other. So it may I'm just throwing. I might be wrong, but I'm just throwing ideas out there.
I think Japan also for Moses' burial as well, by the way, but.
Yeah, and the Quran borrows other things from Gnostic sources, like the miracle of Jesus when he was a child. Creating a clay bird and making it alive. Breathing life into it.
And Satan refusing to bow to Adam. That's from a Gnostic text.
Okay,
that's in the Quran. Yeah. Quran has a lot of Gnostic stuff.
Right. We agree on that. Actually, I think we all do that on that.
I read the Quran recently, the whole thing, and it actually doesn't say that that Judas was the one that replaced Jesus. It just says another was made to look like him. It doesn't say who.
Yeah.
So,
but it's not clear if traditionally they do think that, but I think there's I've heard Muslim scholars say that whether it means another was made to look like him or it just says like it was made so like as if Jesus like swooned and then survived, or that Allah made it to where it just looked like he was dying anyway. Like it's not clear, and there's different interpretations in that, but he didn't die apparently. So.
It's very interesting to hear all those alternative theories. I like them, but who knows? Anyways, thank you for that super chat. Appreciate that. Here's the last super chat that was paid that I can see right now. Back to the confessor, Stephen. What % on Joseph of Arimathea existing?
50% coin flip. I don't know. Maurice Casey's identification of Arimathea with Rama, and what I've heard from I think Robert Price and maybe Dennis McDonald saying that Carrier. I don't know. One of those three guys saying that that it means best disciple town. Both of those seem equally likely to me. I don't know, but I don't think that it would be implausible for the gospel writers to make up a fake Sanhedrin member to become Jesus' disciple and give him a fancy tomb. I don't think I've heard apologists say they couldn't have made that up because somebody would have known that it was a fake name. I don't think that anybody would have been able to identify or there's 70 Sanhedrin members that one of them was made up. Yeah, I think it's equally likely either way. I don't know.
I don't know the percentages, but I agree with his last point. I don't think it's a strong argument to say that people would have said, "Oh, he didn't exist," because it's like you're talking about a figure at the time, and it's like if you ask
from decades ago,
you name a state senator from 30 years ago or something like that. Like in terms of granted, the communities were more tight knit than that, so it's a little bit different. But yeah, I agree with that. That's not the strongest. Plus, if you read the Gnostic Gospels like that, they give names to unnamed people all the time. Like it's the people on the cross are given names. The wise men are eventually given names. Like that wasn't uncommon.
Yeah.
So
I'm 50-50.
So we got a couple questions that I'm looking at. I'm just going to look through whoever's. You start dropping them right now if you guys want. If whoever's watching, you just start dropping questions.
I don't know how long you want to go for. We're almost at 2 hours.
Yeah.
We're starting
let's
to get.
Just do like 5. The first 5, 4. I see. It'll do 4. How about that?
Okay.
So he's a person from the cross who was alive. Maybe that's why Jesus was there after the cross.
we kind of just addressed that with the brother thing, right?
Sure.
Yeah. So
I guess that's
really
true.
yeah,
Um,
like if Jesus was switched or there was a different person there who was, yeah.
Yeah. I do not think it's likely at all that Jesus survived the crucifixion.
We agree on that.
Yeah. I think that's very, very unlikely.
Funny to think
not
about,
even
though.
worth considering.
Yeah, just funny that like you look at like pop-up apologetics books, and they'll spend like a lot. Like Gary Habermas says in his Resurrection book, like his big one, he has like 100 pages.
Mojo, you're really dropping these questions on
He
it.
has 100 pages on the swoon theory, and it's like people haven't defended the swoon theory since like the early 1800s. Like, is anyone like still defending this as a real theory? Like, almost no skeptic still uses that.
Conspiracy theorists. That's who.
Yes, anybody who actually like argue, like any professional skeptic who argues that like that's plausible.
Mojo, I'm just going to ask you to please stop putting scripture in the chat. I'm going to have to time you out. People are getting angry about it. I didn't notice it till just now.
Trying to save my soul.
Yeah. Let's
you'll be in front of God, and he'll be like, "I gave you Mojo, and he gave you the one," and that's
right.
That's says, isn't that what the Gospel of Barnabas says? Maybe that's where we're thinking of.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know. I haven't read that.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any more questions. So, let's see. What was the final result of the? There was a lot of votes, by the way.
Let's see. Really? How many people are watching?
Right now, it's 67. There's 147 votes, so people have been in and out watching and stuff. 64% not likely, 22% likely historical, 14% say 50-50. And Caleb, for my audience, that's really good numbers.
Yeah, I mean, I figured there'd be a little bit of bias here with the sample sizing, but yeah, I appreciate that. That's it. And this was really fun. I'm glad you hosted this, Neil. I really appreciate it. And Stephen, you were great.
Yeah,
definitely want to stay in contact and talk more in the future. Hey, Wesley is a cool guy. So yeah, this was definitely fun, and I think and Steve and I are in the same Facebook groups on the Resurrection, so we have talked there. But we've done this because the thing this was brought up, and we kept commenting back and forth, and I was like, would you rather just do a debate where we can do all this there instead of me typing out everything and all our citations back and forth and quotes? Like, so hopefully we won't talk about this again in the comments, because we I think covered everything that we need to, but I hope to definitely do this in the future, and look forward to it. So it's great. I had fun.
Yeah. I really liked how we were able to really narrow it down to the exact things that we disagree on.
Yeah.
That really
helped. It was a specific topic too. If it was the resurrection, that's like, this would be like, we'd spend 10 minutes just on the empty tomb, and you wouldn't be able to get to all of the specific things, right? It would take a while. So I think having a specified debate, and again, I don't think there's been very many ones on just the empty tomb on YouTube, at least. So Neil has a little bit of propriety there, which is nice. But I
think when you have a debate with two people who are arguing good faith,
it's not calling each other liars.
Yeah. Oh, you're a liar. I can't. No, you can get to a place where you can dig into where the disagreement is, and then say, look, this is what I think based on this. This is what you think based on this. Let everyone else decide for themselves who they think is the most convincing. Because you're not going to. It's not about convincing or changing minds. Right. It's about looking and finding out where we disagree on, and then go from there.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And Stephen's too far gone as a godless heathen. I can't save him anyway. But no, but that's good. Stephen, is this your first debate, like on professionally, or have you done other ones before?
No, this is probably my third one, but I haven't done a debate like this in years.
I could tell though, because I thought you did you seemed like you were well seasoned and like knew how to do it, like the timing and all that stuff. So I feel like you had done this before, and that's a compliment. So
yeah, and I've watched a lot of debates, so it's mainly that I know the process because I've watched so many, because I love watching debates. They're so entertaining, and I hope that this one was entertaining to all of our viewers.
Did you see the Ehrman debate with Bass on the Resurrection? I know you're an Ehrman fan, right?
Yes, I did. Yeah, I did. That was on the Unbelievable, right?
It was, and I thought Ehrman handedly won that one, and I say that as a Christian, because I did not think Bass did well. So,
that's
pretty good. Not the best I've seen.
Yeah. It was interesting, the argument he made about the Mormons, about the Mormons having better evidence. I have to look into that. I keep meaning to do that.
Yeah.
That was an interesting argument.
It's true, actually.
Use that future debate. Yeah.
Well, but you were awesome to debate with. You had stronger points than I expected, because preparing for this, I was like thinking, what's the strongest stuff that he could come up with, and you made better arguments than I was able to prepare for. So you
Well,
surprised
I
me.
appreciate that. Yeah,
Mhm.
and yours were good as well. Like I was in our class conversations, I was figuring you're going to go with the non-burial thing, so I had a lot of notes on that. But the other
Yeah.
two I wasn't expecting, and I thought like that's where you had to like think on your feet. And I'm actually glad we did. I'm pleasantly surprised we got to talk about like the site and the archaeology and the veneration, because that usually doesn't. It very rarely gets brought up, and I'm like, oh yes, we got to talk about this. And he actually you had quotes ready, and I was like, that. I'm like, good for him, like him preparing for that. So
and you had a great PowerPoint, like very well put
Thank
together. You scared me at the beginning with the math, and the probability and stuff. I'm like, oh crap, is there going to be a lot of math in this?
No, I'm not gonna. I'm bad at math. I like Bayesian epistemology, but I can't do them. It was literally just evident hypothesis 1 versus 2. There is, I think Craig does do a Bayesian analysis, William Lane Craig, on the burial of Jesus. I'm skeptical how accurate you can do that with. I think a lot of that's skeptical. I know
Richard
by saying.
Carrier,
I know by saying
really
that
turned me off on that Bayesian stuff.
Richard Carey is going to call me a hack now for saying that.
Yeah.
But I do think Bayes' theorem is really interesting, and I do like it. It's just how you use it is what matters. So
right.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Well, links for both you are in the description. For Stephen, I have the Myth Vision podcast group. You post a lot in there, really good posts. So people can go find your posts in there and read your stuff. And then Caleb, your links are in there as well for your stuff. So, and people
maybe you could link to my Pocket Rebuttals YouTube channel.
Send me that link right after this. I'll add it right. Sounds good.
Cool.
And you attain true gnosis.
Yeah.